Okay, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is another edition of Friends and Enemies. And this week, we're going to be covering the latter part of the Cold War. We're going to get into the end of the Carter administration and the Reagan administration, the Able Archer exercise that almost ended in World War III, what was described by Peter Vincent Pry in his book War Scare. Then we're going to get into the Iran-Contra, the Reagan military buildup and the Reagan policy of supporting anti-communists in Nicaragua and Angola and Afghanistan, and of course the Iran-Contra scandal that was central in the latter Reagan administration, leading up is sort of a prequel to the very supposed end of the Cold War, when Gorbachev appears and starts claiming to reform the Soviet Union. Of course, he is reforming things, but are those reforms really a change in the strategic objectives of Moscow? So I thought I would just begin. My co-host is Alex Benesch in Germany, in Bavaria. Say hi, Alex.
Hey everyone, this is
And
um, this is gonna
and
be
I'm in the
a
USA.
good
Yeah.
one again.
Yeah. So anyway, I should just mention Jimmy Carter. Of course, you had the Watergate scandal, where the Watergate plumbers broke into the Watergate building to tap phones of the Democratic National Committee, and they got caught by security guards. And of course, it was James McCord leading a group of burglars, and of course, you have a number of Gordon Liddy was part of this group. You had it going all the way back up to the White House. You had John Dean, the White House lawyer, who sort of ratted on the president, supposedly. Then you had Nixon's tapes that showed that he had some kind of knowledge. And of course, Nixon ends up being impeachment proceedings begin against him. And I think it was Senator Barry Goldwater, who was a stalwart defender of President Nixon until he realized Nixon had lied to him and said, "I'm not going to support you anymore." So Nixon resigns in, I think it was October of 1974. And of course, you have the brief presidency of President Ford, the only president of the United States to serve that was not elected. He was appointed vice president because Vice President Spiro Agnew had been scandalized and had had to resign. So we had both a president and a vice president of the U.S. resigning. And they were, Agnew was a very hardline conservative from Delaware, the same state as Biden is from. But he had all this corruption in his background. And, political corruption has been endemic to Democratic or Republican systems because of the interplay of business and government. And so then Ford is challenged by Jimmy Carter, governor from Georgia, and Carter is, of course, continues. He doesn't keep Kissinger, but he has his own Secretary of State. And he continues this. He wants to put an emphasis on human rights, and he doesn't want to support evil dictatorships. The Republicans, you had the Church Committee, the CIA is blamed for supporting these corrupt or evil regimes like Somoza in Nicaragua, like the Shah in Iran. And of course, under Jimmy Carter, the communists take advantage of this and they overthrow Somoza through a combination. It starts out, it's a revolution against Somoza. It's supposed to be liberal, but the communists end up hijacking the revolution. And of course, in the Shah of Iran is overthrown. And of course, Carter doesn't really do anything to support the Shah. The Shah is dying of
What about the
cancer
role of
too.
Brzezinski in this? I mean, wasn't
Zbigniew
he?
Brzezinski was a national security advisor and he was considered a Cold Warrior, a right-wing
Mm-hmm.
Cold Warrior. But Brzezinski was a liberal Democrat as well. So you'll see communists will say really bad things about Brzezinski. A lot of people on the far right think Brzezinski is a agent of the globalist
Yeah.
conspiracy, and they'll point to his connections to the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, which Brzezinski was an advisor to. But Brzezinski was probably most effective, and he actually worked with Sadat. You got to remember that one of the things the Carter administration did right was they helped to make peace between Egypt and Israel, and that brought Egypt out of the communist bloc, out of the Soviet bloc. which had been a big thing. Having Egypt is the largest Arab country. It has the largest population of Arabs.
Very close to Europe.
And it is, the canal is strategically important too. And of course, after we talked about the Yom Kippur War, where the Bar-Lev line, which is a Israeli giant fortified line that ran right along the canal, the Suez Canal, they used the canal as their moat for that defense, was breached by the Egyptian Third Army, which broke through in behind it. But then that army got cut off by an air mobile operation that crossed onto the other side by the Israelis, and then that brought the Soviets and Americans together. But Sadat had actually been trying to shake loose from the Soviets before Yom Kippur. He talked about peace and nobody would believe him. And so he went and did the war, created the crisis, and then got the Americans to listen. And I don't think Kissinger was helpful to him. It was Carter, really, and Brzezinski and Carter's Secretary of State, whose name is eluding me now, who later served in other administrations, later served in other capacities, but it's the Egyptian shifting from the East Bloc to the West, and the stabilization, the peace between Israel and Egypt was big because Syria could not launch a war against Israel; it was too weak versus Egypt, and Syria was an unstable regime to begin with. And of course, Jordan was always sort of in the American camp, along with Saudi Arabia. And so this was a very positive thing. And the Soviets realized they had to do something. And of course, the weakness was the Shah of Iran, the bad reputation that Savak had, which was the Iranian secret police. And so they realized they could maybe mount a revolution there. They also tried a revolution in Saudi Arabia by the attack on the Grand Mosque. And we know that they were East German and Libyan trained, Muslim terrorists there. And this is the beginning of their using radical Islam in a big way, a kind of left-wing Islam, to try to shift the balance in the Middle East. Now, Iran is a more important country in many respects than Egypt because it's sitting on a lot of oil, and it's in the Persian Gulf, and it's closer to Saudi Arabia. So this was really the back door they used. And of course, to buttress this, the Soviets in 1979 also invaded Afghanistan, which I mentioned at the end of it. So these disasters, the Iran hostage crisis, this is where they took the American embassy hostage. And by the way, Joseph Bodansky basically says the KGB was behind this hostage taking. It wasn't really done by the Iranian government itself, didn't take the hostages, but a KGB organized mob. And in fact, John Loftus, in his book, The Secret War Against the Jews, claims that most of the people that took the American hostages weren't even Iranians. They were Palestinians, right? They were radical Palestinians. Of course, the PLO, Yasser Arafat, was trained in Moscow. And he was a communist. He was also, it's claimed that is a secret homosexual. Well, that was the defector Ion Pachepa, who hosted Arafat in Romania. Yasser Arafat would have sex with his bodyguards. They would play lion and lamb. If that's kind of makes you ill, it certainly is a disgusting, detail from Pachepa's book. You could read about it in a book called Red Horizons. Pachepa worked for Ceausescu, the evil communist dictator of Romania. But Romania had a special role. The Soviets would give different East Bloc countries roles in different countries. So, for example, Romania was responsible for helping Egypt, right, when it was part of the Soviet bloc.
Right, and the Germans, the East Germans, they sent either their people to train Muslim groups and African groups, or these Muslims or Africans, they sent their people to East Berlin or to Berlin and got their training there. So the Germans,
and the German experience in Libya, they put East Germans in Libya to help to advise Gaddafi too. And so they had this there was a logic to the way they had different, in that way they would compartmentalize things. So the Bulgarians would be dealing with Turkey, for example, and Romanians with Egypt
and of course
and
Turkey
the East Germans
Turkey
with
was a
Libya.
major force. They were pro-West, and they started to build a significant army. Turkey was always a problem for the Soviets during that time.
Yes, well, I should mention the Year of the Assassins. There was an attempt to destabilize Turkey, and it appeared to be from the right and from the left, where newspaper reporters, journalists, and politicians and other people, there was a wave of assassinations. And this is where what was his name? Mehmet Ali Agca, who shot the Pope, came out. And this is the same era. He had supposedly shot a journalist dead, although it is thought that he maybe took credit for it in order to do other operations. It was like a cover for him. He was put in a prison in Turkey, and he just walked out of the prison. There was something funny happening. He just walked out, and he went to Bulgaria, and Agca had, through the Turkish and Bulgarian mafia, he ends up, it's quite certain, the Italian police are certain, he ends up working for the Bulgarian intelligence service in this plot to kill the Pope, which came from the KGB. The KGB wanted to have cutouts. They wanted to have deniability. Okay, we didn't do it, the Bulgarians. Well, the Bulgarians didn't do it. This Turkish terrorist did it who shot journalists. So they wanted to make it about that. And it's funny that the Pope forgave him and let him out. He went back to Turkey. And that's an interesting story in itself. You're showing us the globe there.
Yeah.
And of course, why shoot the Pope? The Pope was Polish. There was solidarity movement in Poland. And of course, there was some instability in communist Poland because of the initial solidarity was a Christian Catholic prayer circle movement initially, but the communists went to join it and take it over from the inside. But that's a story for later. But the Carter administration, because of the Iran hostage, and you can see here a map, you can see where Iran is. Look at how big Iran is on the Persian Gulf there, around the north side of it. And you'll notice that Iran borders the Soviet Union in the north. Turkmenistan is a Soviet republic. Azerbaijan is a Soviet republic on the either side of the Caspian Sea there. They don't mark the Caspian Sea as that body of water just north of Tehran. And of course, the fall of the Shah destroyed, and the hostage crisis destroyed the presidency of Carter, especially when the rescue operation, they sent helicopters and special operators to do this rescue operation. And out in the desert, there were helicopters collided in fiery crashes, and it ended. So Reagan got elected. Now, what the intelligence sources say, there's this big story about Reagan supposedly, when he's running for president, having a secret deal with the Iranians behind the scenes. And of course, that's all phony baloney. I believe that's just a giant disinformation op, because what the sources, Loftus, you can't believe everything he says, but all of his sources say that was baloney. The Iranians released a hostage on Reagan's inauguration day because they didn't want either Carter or Reagan to get credit. They didn't understand that it would be perceived in America as Reagan scaring them into doing it. And so that's why that looked that way. But the Iranians, they didn't understand the psychology of Americans that well, so they didn't know. At least that's what Loftus says. But anyway, so Reagan comes in. It's this different Americans were very depressed in 1979 and 80. There was massive inflation. The price of gold shot up. There was the oil crisis because of the revolution in Iran. We again had another oil crisis where there's long lines at the gas stations. And I was a college student. I worked at a gas station at the time, and I saw that firsthand, what it was, people desperate for gas. And of course, so we had another, and I was in the Marine Corps Reserve at the time, and I thought, oh my gosh, we're all going to go over there and fight. We thought there was going to be a war. There was not a war. They handed over the hostages, and that ended the crisis. And Reagan came in, and Reagan was going to, basically stand up to the Soviet Union and not allow our allies, further allies like the Shah and like Somoza of Nicaragua to fall. And that began an attempt to stop a communist revolution in El Salvador, which is near to Nicaragua, and to try to overthrow the communist regime. So Reagan's idea wasn't just containment. His idea was rollback on communism. So he wanted to support anti-communist guerrillas. The problem is the Democratic Congress had already forbidden the CIA from, for example, helping anti-communists in Angola. I should mention that there had been a communist revolutions in the Portuguese colonies in Africa, Angola and Mozambique, for example. And in Angola, a war raged between the different factions after that. And so this is where this starts to lead in towards Iran-Contra and what went on. But maybe the big event in early Reagan was that we were behind in nuclear weapons because of Kissinger and Nixon, especially doing those arms deals, and the Russians got way ahead of us. And in war games, we're showing that in the early Reagan administration that we would lose World War III. So maybe, Alex, you can now talk about, because you're in Germany, and there's this thing called Able Archer that happens in 1983, and we come very close to World War III as the Russians want to think, well, we've got the military edge, maybe we need to use it. So go ahead with that.
All right, so there's interesting literature on Able Archer 83. Now, this was, of course, a series of exercises year after year, and some people have overestimated the events surrounding Able Archer 83 in that year. We know it was very, very serious, but not just, of course, because of those exercises. So what happened in 83 was the Americans became more difficult to read. So obviously, when you have human intelligence, when you have agents in America, moles, they can give you a certain picture, but it's not complete. So one of the most important things to know is, when would America go to war? Would they strike first, with nuclear weapons? Are they willing to do that? When might they be doing that? So that becomes sort of the holy grail for Soviet intelligence. Now, when this exercise in 83 came around, the Americans became harder to read. And so this is what freaked out the Soviets. And they had a special operation drawn up, this Operation Rian. And they spent considerable resources on that. And that meant just observing anything they could observe, right? So
maybe you could explain what the acronym RIAN means, what it is.
Do I have that here in my notes?
Or VRAN. It means Strategic Nuclear Rocket War. It's referring to what they're doing is the KGB has been assigned to look for evidence that America is preparing a surprise nuclear strike on the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc.
And so they had to spend considerable resources to count the numbers of cars and parking lots of important buildings associated with NATO and the Americans and the partners of the Americans. So how many cars are there at what time of night? How many windows are lit? How many rooms are occupied? And so it became this obsession, and people in Soviet intelligence started to question Operation Rian, saying we divert assets and resources away from our primary, or from these other targets. Is this really necessary? But this sort of became this obsession with the Soviet leadership because the Americans were doing some different things this time. So radio silence, a special type of radio silence, and they would, just shake things up a little bit and becoming, a more difficult to read target, right? And so some people in the Soviet on the Soviet side, they became sort of convinced and obsessed with this idea that the Americans were going to strike, using this Able Archer 83 exercise as a cover. They would start an exercise and then go live and just turn this exercise into a live attack. However, when you read the literature on Able Archer 83, you have to consider all the other intelligence that the Soviets were receiving, especially human intelligence. So some people with the Soviets, they probably knew that this was paranoia. This was some of the KGB and communist leadership paranoia. That they were always frantic about this sort of thing. And there was also a computer program which the Soviets had, and this program was supposed to measure the overall Soviet strength. Now, whenever this calculation was spitting out a result that was lower than a specific threshold, then the Soviets would actually consider a first strike attack. Now, this was, of course, not the only tool that they had, but the Soviets were always monitoring themselves, and if they had fallen below a certain level of strength, they would have opted for a nuclear first strike, against America. So when this exercise was happening, the Soviets started to activate their nuclear bombers, and they became seriously engaged and involved. And of course, that was noticed by NATO intelligence and the satellites and everything. So this became a worrying situation.
Yeah. So let me interject because I knew Peter Vincent Pry, who was involved in this because he worked for the Office of Soviet Analysis, and he worked for Fritz Ermarth, who was in charge of the warning part of that, of watching for nuclear war. And I also had a chance to talk to a KGB officer who was on the other side, who worked in Europe and was watching the same thing. And so what is fascinating to put the two together, what Peter said is that they of course had gotten NATO saying, look, they're readying bombers in the Warsaw Pact. And of course, there were other things that the CIA was watching, like increased activity at Russian missile bases, ICBM bases, and launch sites. And of course, Fritz Ermarth, if you ever met him, he was a great big, really nice, positive guy, and he was a pro-Reagan guy, really. But he was very optimistic. He was a very optimistic person. And so you can kind of imagine these generals, these NATO generals are saying like, well, Fritz, what's going on here with this? And he said it's just exercises. Basically, they didn't want to sound the alarm that the Soviet Union was about to attack. And basically, Peter wrote a book about this called War Scare. And of course, we didn't, when you see increased activity in the Soviet Union, we're supposed to lower our DEFCON and increase our activity and get ready, because nuclear weapons don't work that you just push a button and they automatically go up. The rocket is a precision instrument. It has to be readied. Your crews have to get ready. It's to have an accurate launch, to have a good accurate launches, you have to prep. And you have to increase activity. And the same thing for getting bombers ready. And, there's just a lot of work goes into making forces at that readiness level. And we have these things called DPS satellites that watch those sites in the Soviet Union. We're watching them to see what the activity was. And of course, it turned out we did not get ready. They got ready. But then all of a sudden, this is what Peter told me, back in 1999, he said, all of a sudden, the Russians stood down right at the moment when, and he said, if they had attacked when we weren't ready, they could have won World War III right there. And of course, the U.S. in the early Reagan administration, they'd done war games showing that the Soviets, the first two times they played it, the Soviets won World War III in these realistic war games. All arms nuclear war, which was kind of scary. And a lot of the reforms in the Reagan administration were conducted based on the war games to make sure that we protected our assets so that we wouldn't lose that first phase. And of course, there's a book about that. I think it's called War Games, and it talks about how James Dunnigan and Simon Redmondson were the war game developers at Simulations Publications in New York that became Pentagon contractors and made these games. But anyway, now what's interesting is that, and I asked Peter, well, if they had a chance to beat us, why didn't they take it? And he didn't know. I mean, it was a mystery. What had happened in 1983, from the American point of view of the Soviets getting ready, was a mystery. Well, the KGB guy I spoke with, he said, "Oh yeah," he said it was the army, the Soviet military under Dmitry Ustinov. He was the Soviet defense minister in the early 80s. Ustinov would go to Brezhnev, this is in the late 70s, and he want to talk to him about what he was building and how he was getting ready for World War III. And Brezhnev was, in his latter years, he was ill a lot. He said, Dmitry, I'm going home. I don't feel well. I trust you. Do whatever you want, whatever you need to do. And this is the late Brezhnev era. There was a lot of autonomy given to the different ministries. And so the defense ministry became very powerful and independent in developing its nuclear war strategy. And it pretty much had carte blanche to develop whatever it thought it needed. And of course, this created its own logic of, you're building for nuclear war, you're gaining this supremacy, you want to push for it. And what my KGB source told me was that then after Brezhnev died and Andropov, the former head of the KGB, became the head of the Soviet Union, and I think it was 1982 that Brezhnev died, Andropov was in there, and all of a sudden the army is saying, we need to look for, the Americans are going to start this war with Able Archer. They're going to attack us. We have to get ready. We have to strike them first. Because in a nuclear war, if you take the first strike, you take the big hit, you lose a lot of your nuclear weapons right at the outset if you take that big hit. So the idea is you need to strike first. And of course, they were looking for gold, the U.S. accumulating gold. And of course, it was ridiculous. And the KGB knew it was ridiculous, that they were watching the West. There was no Reagan plan for a surprise nuclear attack. They knew Able Archer was not. And that made them suspicious of the generals. And the generals insisted it was that they had to get ready, and they were getting ready to attack. But it ended up that because Andropov was a KGB guy, and the KGB didn't trust the Russian generals about this, they were afraid the Russian generals would use World War III to take over the country and get rid of them.
Yeah, because it's like this triple system
the Iron
of
Triangle,
the party,
right?
The intelligence services, and the military.
Yeah, it's the Iron Triangle that governed the Soviet Union. Their system of checks and balances was the party at the top with the army and the KGB as rivals, and it's a bunch of men with guns pointed at each other's heads is what it basically is. The army is the thing in the Soviet Union with the most guns, so it's blind. It's not allowed to conduct any domestic intelligence. The KGB gets to spy on the army. The party spies on both. So you got the commissars in the army, and you've got the administrative organs spying on the KGB. So you've got oversight so that the party maintains control over both. Well, what you had suddenly the army saying, look, this is World War III, because this is what they trained for. This is what they prepped for. Why else were they doing all this stuff? And suddenly the KGB is going, well, wait a minute. Reagan isn't going to attack. They're not being honest with us. So Andropov pulled the plug. And you will notice that after Andropov pulled the plug and you get Chernobyl, there's a period when you have Gorbachev coming in where there's a purge, a hidden purge of the Soviet military that goes on in the 1980s. You had the Matthias Rust. Maybe you could talk about him. How many Soviet generals got fired? Matthias Rust was a German kid who flew a plane into Red Square.
Yeah. I mean, it's like,
and that embarrassed the air defense commanders in the Air Force.
That happened recently, right? With the mini drones in from Ukraine to Moscow. When they
back in 1980, what was it, 1985? Matthias Rust was at 85 or 86. He flies in to Moscow from Germany, and he lands. And he flies through all the defenses, all the Soviet defense. How does he do it without being shot down? He flew low under the radar. And that really revealed a problem. And of course, you have helicopter. You get to 1987, you've got a whole helicopter full of colonel generals that goes down, and they all die in a helicopter crash. 5 colonel generals. You have firings. You have people from remote commands replacing other Soviet generals. So there was the KGB had decided to do this deception strategy, this reform strategy, rather than World War III. And this was an old argument, I mentioned it before, between the army and the party and the KGB over strategy. Were they going to follow a Sun Tzu strategy or a nuclear warfighting strategy? Yeah. And the initial idea was to do both. Well, when it came down to it, they had to do one or the other first. Yeah. So that was how it played out.
We can tell nowadays, we can see very well how these KGB guys are bullying around the military guys, right? It's shake up of the personnel, and just you can see who's in charge. And Andropov, of course, is very important to Vladimir Putin, and that whole special select group that started to happen in the 80s, when specific KGB people were picked for this transition phase. When the Communist Party was then removed from the decision making and all that, and just the KGB took power. So it used to be party KGB military, and now it's the KGB that runs it.
Well, and we don't really know. I mean, Golitsyn claimed that the party would remain in control and just go underground.
Yeah,
so,
of course you could always change who's running.
Yeah, there's some evidence that the party still exists and it just went underground, that it isn't. And the KGB, by the way, is a gun-toting part of the Communist Party. There was nobody in the KGB that wasn't Communist Party. So that's an interesting thing too, because the KGB it's a part of the Communist Party. It's the sword and shield of the Communist Party.
Yeah, and
so the idea of the Communist,
they had so many members of the Communist Party that it's very specific who is in charge of really running the party, and then there's these many party officials that you can just ditch it publicly, so the world says, well, communism's over, right?
Yeah, and this is where we get to where we can cover. But the thing is what we see is that a lot of the same people ended up in charge, the large corporations. You see these KGB guys moving into positions in corporations and former party people. So there wasn't. I remember there was a Ukrainian who said some years ago. He said, it's not really a KGB regime in Ukraine. This is before the revolution that overthrew Yanukovych or caused him to flee to Moscow. He said it's the Communist Party Soviet Union underground that we're fighting. And I think that's more accurate. Of course, there's a lot of room for debate because the regimes in the former Soviet Union, the former Soviet Republic, are for the most part quite opaque. And since they practice deception, it's very hard to know the truth unless you've got specific people on the ground you can talk to who are willing to actually let you in to some of the things that are going on. And of course, so this is what the early Reagan administration's dealing with Andropov, who dies of kidney failure, of course, is replaced by Chernobyl while they're training Gorbachev to do, because originally the perestroika, the big perestroika in Glasnost was going to happen under Andropov. He was going to actually do it. This KGB guy, just like Putin's a KGB guy, was going to do all the changes.
Yeah, and Gorbachev was like a bench warmer, right? Gorbachev was pulled into the Central Committee. He was a regional guy who was, just entertaining
He was from Stavropol. He was a governor of Stavropol Oblast in the far south of Russia, the warmest. It's the wine country of Russia, of the Soviet Union. And of course, he was Andropov liked to vacation down there. There were hot springs and places down there, and he got to meet this young governor, and he got to like him. And Andropov, if you study Andropov was very much into becoming close to the leaders down in the Caucasus area, southern Russia area. He was close to the Grey Wolf of Azerbaijan. He was close to Edward Shevardnadze in Georgia, the MVD general and head of the Communist Party of Georgia, by the way. And of course, Gaidar Aliyev was the Grey Wolf in Azerbaijan and head of the Communist Party in Azerbaijan. Okay, so he wasn't just a KGB general. He wasn't just the head of the KGB in Azerbaijan. He was the head of the Communist Party in Azerbaijan. And these people ended up leading Edward Shevardnadze and Gaidar Aliyev, the independent Azerbaijan, the independent Georgia. So you have supposedly the head of the Communist Party of Georgia who ran all these torture chambers in Georgia, Edward Shevardnadze, suddenly a liberal, right? And Gaidar Aliyev is suddenly not a communist. Now, so how does the head of the Communist Party in both these republics become non-communists? But they were all deputies. When Andropov got in as head of the KGB, which is around 1967, he brings these people into these positions in Georgia. And of course, the KGB works differently in Georgia. The MVD is important there because the KGB was purged of Georgians because it was headed by a Georgian back when Stalin was killed. Stalin was a Georgian, and Lavrenti Beria was a Georgian, and they were scared of the Georgian mafia, right? So they purged Georgians out of the KGB back when Stalin died in 1953. So Georgia, then the MVD was what was important in Georgia. So you have, and in terms of the ethnic Georgians. So anyway, so Andropov is setting these people up, but sort of the kingpin in between is this guy down there, Gorbachev, who he brings in as agriculture minister, right? Because it's a breadbasket down there, and it's interesting. But from everything we know, Gorbachev was not really, as a younger person, a liberal. The people that knew him in college, he was more of a Stalinist or a neo-Stalinist. He was an old-fashioned Marxist-Leninist.
And it was a really fast career that Gorbachev had. I think he was like the fastest guy to ever reach the Politburo, I think it was. I mean, it was lightning fast, and also in the 80s, of course, we saw this other group that was being created, groomed, built by the KGB. This was, of course, Sobchak in St. Petersburg. He was teaching at the university. And, in the 80s, you saw Vladimir Putin studying at the same the same St. Petersburg or Leningrad, whatever, university. And I just to briefly mention it, if you haven't seen, the previous episodes of Friends and Enemies, I mentioned this recently in the show. There was sort of this fake conservative underground, and people were led to believe in the West that Putin was a member, and Sobchak was a member of that right-wing underground. And the argument was Sobchak's family came from the one end of the Soviet Union, right next to, I think, Mongolia. Then the family moved to the other end of the Soviet Union, and periphery, and then Sobchak gets to St. Petersburg. So these people were groomed in these faraway places, and then brought to the mega cities and presented as the new guys, the new breed. Just to have more credible looking guys, because Andropov had this large history. He had all those things under his belt. They could have presented him as a guy who did all these big operations and had this international experience, but ultimately they went with people like Sobchak and Putin, who seemed less entangled in the Soviet history.
Yeah, there's a book that is really worth looking at if you want to start to try to understand this Andropov period. This book, Yuri Andropov, A Secret Passage into the Kremlin, by Vladimir Soloviev and Elena Klepakova. And this is really, you look at how many marks I put in here. Mm-hmm. This book is to understand, and of course, there's so many little tells in here that what Golitsyn was talking about was organized by him. that you could see that what he was doing, what he was organizing in the republics and in the outer parts of the Soviet Empire, is he was organizing for this perestroika and glasnost. He was one of the architects of this whole thing, and of course it's. We know that of course this plan originated from the Golitsyn's the defector, KGB defector Major Anatoly Golitsyn, that there was this reorganization of the KGB in the late 50s to carry out this long-range deception that had these two parts, which was the Sino-Soviet split there'd be a fake split to get the West to build up China, fake split between China and the Soviet Union to get that to happen, and then the other one was a false liberalization. I mean, there would be a lot of true things about the liberalization. They would loosen the system, but they were creating mechanisms to have a controlled opposition movements. So a lot of the, Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia was actually, if you go into the history of it, and I've talked to members of it saying, look, this was the secret police started this and drew us into it because they wanted to control it. The takeover of Solidarity, I talked, the reason they formed Fighting Solidarity in Poland was the communists took over Solidarity after it initially proved to be effective. And so they were always, they either take over opposition movements that start to exist, or they create their own, like you were talking about Putin going out to this castle to meet with this Russian princess who was married to the Metternich family. They have different ways of conveying, look, secret Christian group has taken over Russia, or these secret conservatives or czarists. This goes back to the trust operation back in the early 1920s. That Felix Dzerzhinsky and Menzinsky had brainstormed and Lenin had approved, where they convinced the West that the communism was dead back at the beginning of the Soviet Union. So they're beginning to move, since they had their brush with nuclear war in 1983, where the army almost got its way. The army almost sort of like panicked everybody into going into a World War III. They said, no, we're following our strategy, our long-range strategy. We're going to do these reforms. The West will disarm. We will get rid of the nuclear weapons in Europe, which they did. And so this was what they were doing. At the same time, though, they needed to soften up the conservatives in the West. They needed to scandalize Reagan and Thatcher.
Yeah, and of course, we've heard Putin talk about his favorite czars, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Now, even Peter the Great was a Romanov, and the origin of the Romanovs, that's of course Russian people, but then it became more and more German. Now, Catherine the Great was very German, and both of these czars, they had this idea that Russia, or at least they pretended this idea that Russia should be a European country, not an Asian country. So this was sort of the pitch that they tried. And so by making all these Russian aristocrats shave their beards and change the clothing and start to learn French and all that. So this is sort of this was in the past, but then Putin is mentioning this a lot because that was kind of his initial gimmick, that he wanted to take over or continue where Peter the Great left off and Catherine, the Great left off, just schmoozing up to the West and, mentioning all the stuff that's familiar, the Roman heritage, because Europe is based on the Western Roman Empire, and Russia is influenced by the Eastern Roman Empire. So it's this whole thing, this whole gimmick of, this is a conservative revival in Russia. And, This played into the fake oligarchs that the Russians then created in the 90s. And we know that the KGB, even in the 80s and the 70s, the KGB had this unit that would study Western capitalism, and they would study all the stuff that was done in the West through the corporations and the banks and the tax havens and everything. So by the time, this transition happened in the early 90s, the KGB knew very well what to do, where to move money, and how to create somewhat believably looking oligarch. This was pitched to the West as, look at us. We're doing the same things that you did. We now have these captains of industries that become fabulously rich, and they're billionaires, and they fly around in their jets, and they buy up sports teams in Europe. But there's a huge difference, and people can check, an older episode of Friends and Enemies about the captains of industry, because these American industrialists, they were actually captains of industry. They created these steel companies and car companies, and they made all these things, and they were profitable. But these Russian oligarchs, they were as fake as it gets, right? I mean, this was not the same.
Lev Timofeyev, and I think his book was written in 1996, it was a book called Russia's Secret Rulers, and he talks about people speaking out of school about, well, this capitalism in Russia, the way they're arranging it, it's arranged by the old structures and by the mafia. And of course, as he goes on through the book, he says, well, look, this is either the mafia taking over or the KGB is using the mafia and using these oligarchs. And it's all managed.
I think that's
he reveals a lot of things in that book, which is later, more details come out in Karen DeWish's book, Putin's Kleptocracy, showing how the KGB was behind the transition. And of course, I have multiple sources from the former Soviet Union about how these different oligarchs were recruited by the KGB, signed contracts with the KGB.
Yeah, exactly.
Whether it's Mikhail Khodorkovsky or Boris Berezovsky. I talked to a friend of Boris Berezovsky and I said, well, I never read that anywhere that Boris had signed an agreement with the KGB. He says, oh, yeah. But the thing is, they were afraid to say this or publish it because they did fear assassination for revealing that.
This is even quoted in Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, where she says that at some location there were leftover documents that were not destroyed. Somebody just messed up somehow.
Of Boris Berezovsky's documents?
I'm not exactly sure where it was, but it's basically a description of at least part of that contract. And I'm going off memory here. It says something like, sign here, you will become basically a fake oligarch, but you have to give back the money if we ask for it, and you have to give it back immediately. The first time we ask, you have to give it back. The moment you break those rules, the moment you become difficult and make excuses, we will come after you.
Yeah. And of course, Boris Berezovsky, for example, was found in his bathroom, supposedly hung himself. But what the medical examiner, the forensic pathologist found was that somebody had hanged him, had strangled him first, and then hung him up there. So, and of course, he had been one of the major people that broke with the regime. You've got Guzinski, who owned these media companies in Russia. They basically threatened him with prison, and they let him go to Israel if he just gave everything back, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have Mikhail Khodorkovsky. I don't know how many years he spent in jail.
Wasn't it?
And, of course, he's been let out, and he speaks against Putin, but he doesn't admit what I heard directly from a former Soviet intelligence person that knew that he was picked because, Mikhail Khodorkovsky was a communist. He was a second secretary in Komsomol. And it was Western investors were looking at gas and oil investments in the former Soviet Union, or I think it was even still the Soviet Union at the moment. And they said, wouldn't it be nice if a nice young Jewish boy ran this company? Mm-hmm. And they said, well, where can we get a nice young Jewish boy? Oh, there's that Mikhail Khodorkovsky, that second secretary in Komsomol.
Roman Abramovich. These guys.
And Roman Abramovich is another one of them. Yeah, exactly. Who is apparently stayed loyal to Putin despite all that he's done. I think that in the Boris Berezovsky story, you find that he betrayed Berezovsky in the end.
Yeah, so they started suing each other, and there was all this craziness going on. And wasn't it Bill Browder who messed things up a bit for the Russians? When he started to invest and he paid some kids on the street to get him a CD with databases, so where you can buy the shares cheap. to get
the
ownership of
Bill
industries?
Browder story is we're not really at that part of the story yet, so maybe we should say
All
that
right.
for later. But Bill Browder was the grandson of the head of the Communist Party USA,
Oh no.
and he ends up bringing billions and billions of dollars of investment for Putin. I mean,
Oh.
he brought so much. The swindle. How many people got their money out of the Bill Browder investments? He was trying to, and then all of a sudden he turns against Putin supposedly and says he's bad and we need to have these reforms, these changes because his lawyer gets put in jail and dies.
Yeah.
But it's not really. You got to look at this with a critical eye with Bill Browder, especially when you see that. What was it, Jackson Vanik? They repealed things that were much harder on Russia to put in things that were targeting individual Russians, as if now we're not sanctioning Russia, we're just sanctioning these officials in Russia and their bank accounts, or these oligarchs and their bank accounts. And it's like, but that's not really sanctioning Russia anymore. So I have these questions about it, like what? So this is a question that, and of course, what we hear in the media is like this different version. It's like, well, you're leaving some things out. So I have great concerns about it, given the deceptive nature of everything else that's happened in Russia.
The whole bit about moving all this money, Russian money to the city of London, that was when the Ukraine invasion happened, finally, like 20, 30 years too late, mainstream media here in Germany especially, mainstream media started to really get onto this and looking at all these different Russians that moved the money to the city of London.
Well, and this is good segue to go back to our narrative about the 1980s, because you have this bank called BCCI, which jokingly Robert Gates referred to the Bank of Crooks and Criminals International, right? BCCI is a bank that the CIA and MI6 and these other groups can move money through and support other companies and operations. And of course, there was a British agent named Leslie Aspin who apparently got recruited by the Americans. And the British, and this is where we're heading for Iran-Contra, and we've got the communists are taking over these African countries like Angola and Mozambique, the Portuguese African countries, terrible communist revolutions there, and of course Namibia, and of course you've got Zimbabwe with Robert Mugabe coming in around 1980, I think it was, where Rhodesia disappeared, it becomes Zimbabwe, and it's a communist. I mean, he's a Maoist, right? The real competition in Zimbabwe, when you give the black people the vote, in Zimbabwe, is between a pro-Russian communist and a pro-Chinese communist, and the pro-Chinese communist in Zimbabwe wins, formerly Rhodesia. And of course, you have people fleeing from Rhodesia into South Africa, white people. A lot of the farmers stayed and ended up feeding the country until more recently they even went after them. And you had starvation in the country. But Robert Mugabe was supported. They brought North Korean troops into the country to support Robert Mugabe's regime. And there you see South Africa, you see Botswana was a sort of a puppet state, a conservative black puppets, a very successful black country, with white shadow ministers. You have, but you have Zimbabwe. Where do you have? Okay, Harare. You have Zimbabwe there. And of course, you have Angola. You see where Angola and Namibia are. Mozambique, this is a German spellings, I guess, on the country.
Yeah,
Mozambique
is German. I think
opposite Madagascar.
They also changed the names of some of these countries.
Yeah, if they go back down, they don't show Zimbabwe. What are they calling Zimbabwe? Botswana? Zambia? No. What are they doing? No. Harare is the cap. Okay, they don't even see that. You see Zimbabwe down there, but they don't name the country. They just show Harare. And that's kind of funny, but I don't know when is this map? This map isn't current.
No, this is Google Earth But they changed some of the
that's kind of a
names,
funky
especially
map.
this is like this is the German Google Earth, so
I see Tanzania.
they have different names for some of these.
Well, and then go up to Ethiopia. The communists end up taking over Ethiopia, and I met one of the last proteges just by accident, just 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. I met the protege of the Emperor Haile Selassie, the last Ethiopian emperor, and how the communists tried to recruit him, and he was not. He was a Christian. He wouldn't participate in the regime. What was his name? Mangetsu. And he described him. He knew the guy. He was just a hair trigger psychopath communist. And the communists took over Ethiopia and, of course, ruined the country. There was massive starvation, warfare. I mean, the communist regime ultimately failed. They brought in Cuban troops, if I remember correctly, in there. That was a communist disaster, and just like with the killing fields in Cambodia, a lot of people died and a lot of starvation happened, a lot of destruction. So that was a disaster there, and it's still it doesn't end. The communist involvement, the Chinese attempts, but I think there's some people down there that have obviously kept the communists from consolidating their power. Now, if you go down further south, we can talk about in the mid-70s. Angola and Mozambique, which is shown on the southern part of the map. Angola and Mozambique. Angola is quite a big country. It's a Portuguese colony. And there was a communist revolution there in the mid-70s. Mozambique and the right, same thing. The communists really planned this well. And there was a guy named Jonas Savimbi who started out being a communist, but ended up turning against communism. And Ronald Reagan ended up supporting Jonas Savimbi and the South African government. And they call this war the Angola War, where South Africa helped to support Jonas Savimbi down there. I had a South African journalist friend, Janie Allen, who had interviewed Jonas Savimbi and was just in awe of him as a person. Sadly, Jonas Savimbi was killed, I believe, by a sniper I think it was in the late 90s. After the fall of the Soviet Union, you see what happened to all these. Now, I think it was in 1983 or 4, Angola and Mozambique and Zimbabwe officially declared themselves in the mid-80s Marxist-Leninist states. And I think Namibia did too, but you might want to check that. So you had all around South Africa, you had communist regimes forming all around it, like they were surrounding South Africa. And then you had this movement in the United States to embargo South Africa because they were a racist apartheid regime. But of course, the communists were behind this whole thing because look at this part. You've got go a little further south and show the ocean down there off the Cape. And of course, you're not showing the English names. A little bit to the left, you've got the Cape. Sea route is right under the Cape Sea route where the big oil big oil tankers, they carry oil from the Middle East, can't go through the Suez Canal.
They have to go around.
In fact, that was a result of the Suez crisis we talked about last week, where the British and French tried to take the canal back. The super tanker was invented as a response to the Nasser taking the canal. They said, well, if we have to ship the oil all that way and we can't take the shortcut, we need bigger ships, right? Yeah. To make it cost effective. So that's where they came up with the giant oil tankers. It was for this purpose because oil tankers are so big, they can't pass through the canal. And you had the canal during the, between 1967 and 73, I don't think any ships passed the canal because it was a battle zone. It was a fortified area of Egypt and Israel before that war. So the Cape Sea route is very important. And then you have the mineral storehouse of Africa. Not only South Africa, but the surrounding regions, there's incredible wealth of not just gold, but all kinds of precious metals, things that are used in advanced aircraft and aerospace and weapons and so on. So this whole area is the mineral. I mean, there's another big mineral storehouse in the world, by the way, is the Soviet Union. So for the West, this was it. And of course, you have the Democratic Republic of Congo, you show up there. What's interesting about that is that there was a communist takeover was prevented in there by the CIA, depending on which version how bad the CIA is. you had the Mobutu Sese Seko, supposedly the CIA's guy, one of these corrupt dictators who's keeping this region from falling to communism. Well, he gets cancer, very much like the Shah did. Mm-hmm. And there's a revolution in 1997 after the fall of the Soviet Union. There's a communist revolution led by Laurent Kabila, an old friend of Che Guevara. Che Guevara, a lot of people don't know, Che Guevara came down into this area and worked with Laurent Kabila. Before he went to Bolivia and got himself killed, he was working in Africa. Che Guevara, after he left Cuba, he first went to Africa to work here.
The superstar from the T-shirts.
The superstar from the T-shirts, Che Guevara. They make him kind of he's a communist Christ, figure. They make him into. And of course, you have this revolution, and of course, a civil war in the Congo follows this revolution. Where we don't know how many millions of people have died in the fighting in the Congo, but the communists have been, and you had all these communist regimes, Angola, Mozambique, sending troops to help, sending mercenaries, sending people to go fight in that war on the communist side. And of course, why is Congo so important? Well, this is what I've read, and maybe somebody will tell me it's not true, but the uranium mine that produced the first atomic bombs, the Fat Boy and what the other one was, was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those bombs were made with enriched uranium and plutonium that ultimately derived from, one was a plutonium bomb and one was a uranium bomb. But the first uranium bomb was made with uranium from a mine in the Congo, which now provides its uranium to North Korea.
Yeah, and also when you look at the history of South Africa, you get into the whole thing with Nelson Mandela and these crazy communists and communist terror groups, and they got the Stasi training. They got these advisors from East Germany, and then they sent their people to East Germany to get trained, and they were all very happy to get that help. And at some point, Nelson Mandela was turned into this phenomenon, just by talking about him, just by creating this legend similar to Che Guevara. And when you just look at the facts, what Nelson Mandela was and what went down there, it's just the same stuff you see in other African countries, during the late Cold War, when communist techniques found their way to these countries and they started to implement them immediately, started hunting people, hunting everybody who was deemed a problem, and they were willing to implement the whole program. So it's easy now. Of course, it's easy to complain about this CIA operation or that CIA operation, but you have to look at the entire picture here, because this was not too far away from the multi-millions of dead people in communist China. That the whole Great Leap Forward and the programs that came afterwards, that was not too far removed, chronologically. So this was a significant threat to different countries down there. But they turned a guy into a phenomenon. And I think that the career of Barack Obama was sort of, I think Barack Obama was built into this politician because he just looks like a younger Nelson Mandela, because he just has that sort of that vibe, and he can sort of just use that image, carry over some of that image to the modern era.
So, well, and of course the situation in Africa, the using of the race, because in American history, the sensitivity of race has to do with blacks were taken in chains from Africa, enslaved here in chattel slavery. I mean, it's just horrible.
But they were sold. They were sold by their local rulers, by the way. So let me just mention this real quick when I show this map. So, so you're looking at the Congo, right? It's a huge country inside of Africa, and
Massive jungle. You can see on this
Yeah.
map the darker green areas are the Congo River.
Yeah. So
Around
when
the river system is massive, thick, dense jungle.
The Congo was basically a kingdom, over 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago. It was a kingdom, and they had many different tribes that spoke different languages and different dialects, so they were not centrally organized like, let's say, a European empire. But they had a king, and they had these crazy rules. You would disobey one of those crazy rules, you would be killed. And then came the Europeans,
The Belgians.
Belgians, Portuguese, and they asked the local Congo rulers, "Hey, can we buy people?" And these Congo rulers said, "Yes, please. We're gonna sell them to you." And so this went on for a while. Until,
I see. This is before the Belgians. Okay.
Yeah, this is even before the
Because
Belgians.
Belgium made that into a colony eventually. Yeah. But yeah, I mean,
even before that, so they were selling their own people. They were selling their own people, and at some point they realized this was getting out of control. But that was kind of the thing. They sold their own people to the Europeans, and it's not like you can forget about that. And of course, at a later stage, this is when I used to scroll up here. Now, Belgium is tiny, obviously. So you're looking at this tiny little thing here. That's Belgium, right? So the ruling house, if I'm not mistaken, was Saxon, Coburg, and Gotha, which is, of course, the same as in Britain. The same as in Britain. But they started to gather investors for a project in the Congo. And, other European countries, they were saying, well, you just try your luck, because it's a very large country, and there's we don't know what's how difficult it's going to be, if it's going to be profitable. So these aristocrats, they started to bring a couple of thousand troops and modern weapons, and they were actually able to control a significant portion of the Congo. Now, if we do this mental experiment, if we assume for a moment that the Congo would have been ahead in terms of technology, it could have been the other way around. It's just a matter of what ruler you get and what they're capable and willing to do. So it's not like we're carrying around this old guilt, because it's just a complicated situation.
There's if people are interested in the problems of these countries, these undeveloped countries, the countries that were subject to colonization, whether in Africa or Latin America or parts of Asia, the works of V.S. Naipaul are worth looking at, and he's written extensively. He also wrote about India. He's an East Indian whose family emigrated to the West Indies. And he's written many scholarly books, but he is a big fan of Joseph Conrad, who was a Polish anti-Russian who was a naturalized British citizen. He became a sea captain. He was a sea captain. And he wrote a very famous story about the Congo called The Heart of Darkness. Which got polluted into a movie called Apocalypse Now, which is kind of a distorted, but it's a very important short story, and many believe that it is an autobiographical story told by Marlowe, a character who always in Joseph Conrad's stories is a sea captain, like Joseph Conrad was, telling the story, and tells the story of Lord Jim, for example, a really very famous novel by Conrad. But the Heart of Darkness story is about the riverboat captain gets assigned to go up the river to find this Kurtz, who is a Belgian commercial representative of a commercial enterprise to get ivory out of the Congo, and but he has gone native, and he has become some kind of god emperor of some kind of bloody empire in the heart of darkness, right? In the heart of this. And he's got to bring this guy back without getting killed. And the guy, of course, dies of malaria on the ride out, was saying in his delirium, the horror. And it's a classic short story. Everybody should read it because it's about colonialism. And Conrad wrote many interesting books about the effects of Europeans on the peoples of these areas of the world. And they're not just, the stories are not what you would think. You need to read them. And of course, as a captain, sea captain, who went all through Asia and Africa and all these places and saw these things back in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, it's a snapshot in time that is really valuable. He also wrote a very interesting book about the communists in Switzerland around World War I, plotting to take over Russia and so on. But Conrad was very deep as a novelist and very profound. He also wrote a book called The Secret Agent, about a Russian secret agent operating in London. And I think I've mentioned it in the past. But this Heart of Darkness story, there's a story he tells, a short story about this European that comes down to set up a trading post down along the coast of sub-Saharan Africa. And it's actually two Europeans, and they're greedy. And they treat the natives with a great deal of disrespect, and they don't really know what they're doing, and they end up dying because they don't know what they're doing. They end up killing themselves. It's like Darwin Award winners. And these two clever Africans take over the outpost and just make out like bandits. That's one of the stories about colonialism. The Heart of Darkness is another story about it, about the way that this interaction between Europeans. And the end of the story, Marlowe is telling the story while sitting on a ship sort of anchored in the mouth of the Thames River. And he says, and of course the Thames is a great river like the Congo. And he says, so just imagine when Julius Caesar rode up this river into Britain for the first time, when we were savages, when the British were savages. Imagine what this experience, this contact was. And now ask yourself, who is really the barbarian, right? Who is really corrupting who here? And is it the Heart of Darkness is that Kurtz was himself a savage. He had the veneer of civilization. He was an artist. He had aspirations to lead a political party in the future. Sound familiar? An artist who wants to lead a political party. And yet he goes to make his fortune in Africa, and he finds his vocation as a political leader down there. Yeah. It's an interesting moral tale.
Yeah, and it's a problem. Of course, it's a problem if even in the modern era you still had these, like King Leopold II, I believe it was. You still have these dynasties that go back 1,000 years, Sachsen, Coburg, and Gotha, and they become involved in the Congo, and they start making money.
There's Belgian atrocities in the Congo.
You still have those corporations from back then. You still have I think it's called the Société Générale. They're still out there, and it's a problem in the modern era. The Enlightenment era of republics. It's a problem if you still have these people around, because they're from a different era. And I said this before, when we judge the Middle Ages, and we judge the earlier empires and even the ancient empires, it was a different world, because it was so difficult to allow more freedom, and to
and life was so hard, and people it was so died dangerous. At an early age.
It was so dangerous to be moral, in a larger sense. If you allow people more freedom, if you scale back the surveillance and the intimidation, things could become unstable, and you get taken over by internal psychos or external psychos that take you over. So you got to be careful in judging the previous empires without that context. But if you do some of this stuff in the modern era, then it becomes a problem, because in the modern era you do have a choice, because you do have modern technology, and you can have moral, you can have freedom and republics, right?
Yeah. Morality in the ancient world in primitive circumstances is tribal. It's like you don't steal or commit crimes within your own population, but the people out there, it's open season on. We can headhunt them, or we can steal from them, or we can take their stuff and kill them or enslave them. This is sort of primitive humanity's modus operandi, right? It's just we evolve away from that over time. with our more enlightened ideas of a larger humanity and larger kind of society. Look at how big the countries are. Look at how small, when you go back to city states, how things are on this much smaller level. But getting back to our topic, we got sidetracked talking about Africa. This whole deal with you're seeing Africa being taken over by the communists in the 1970s with the move in Angola and Mozambique, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, and so, which was Rhodesia before. You see these takeovers taking place, and the West, even Reagan and Thatcher, are not reacting to it properly. But back in the 70s, where you had the CIA forbidden by Congress to help those who wanted freedom in Angola, you had this BCCI, you had the British, you have this Leslie Aspen, and you have this gun running thing. So they're trying to move guns to who they think are the anti-communists, maybe sometimes they weren't, in these African places. And they're trying to do this, and they're breaking laws doing it, right? I mean, the CIA would be. So they hand it off to the British or the Israelis. And of course, the Israelis and the British are involved in gun running. The Israelis are kind of a little tiny. Their gun running is nothing compared to the British. And the French are involved in this kind of stuff too. And it's part of the dirty game during the Cold War in Africa, right? Does that make sense? And of course, this is where we're getting towards the need to support the Contras fighting the Sandinista communists in Nicaragua, when you have the Boland Amendment and you have Congress saying no to the Reagan administration, we will not allow you to support a counter-revolution in Nicaragua. Okay, so you've got this history of gun running and clandestine operations, even contrary to congressional rules, and you've got British back channel where the British have these, because British colonialism, they had all these networks in Africa. And so they were really, the British were kingpins in this. And of course, it was the dirty secret. The British would blame the Israelis, by the way. Oh, no, we're not doing it. The Israelis are doing it. The Israelis are the bad guys, right? The Israelis were always the ones that were going to get the blame. And so this is how the Iran-Contra thing, what they realize is, how do we supply, this was the question, how do we supply the Nicaraguan Contras, anti-communists, in trying to get the communists out of Nicaragua without violating the law? Congress had said you can't do that. So you have, and of course, George W. Bush is the former head of the CIA, and he's the vice president under Reagan, and he's sort of watching over this, and he's got the back channel to the British.
A workaround,
and the British, of course, have these powerful smuggling networks, and the CIA has its own weapons thing. So the idea is that as long as the U.S. government doesn't pay for the weapons, it's good. It's all good. So the idea is to have these cross deals. And of course, one of the cross deals is you have this guy named William Buckley, not the famous conservative, but a CIA guy operating in the Middle East with others who get kidnapped by extremists in the Middle East, in Lebanon. I think it was Lebanon, right? But they were really, the Syrian intelligence service really had control of those people that had them. But nobody knew that. They thought it was the Iranians, because the Iranians had done the kidnapping before at the end. So they thought, well, we want to get these people released. And so there was, how do we get them released? Well, we make a deal to give armaments, because remember, Saddam Hussein back in 1979, right after the revolution, he decides he wants to do what Sadat did. He wants to get away from the Soviet Union, but he's not sure how, and he decides to attack Iran to say, hey, America, I'm your friend, right? But he doesn't really get away from the Soviets. They're too embedded in his security service and his ruling party, and he can't get away. But he starts this war against Iran, hoping the Americans will supply him. Well, Iran needs weapons because it's in this war with Iraq. So the idea is, if we can sell weapons for hostages and then we get money for the weapons from the Iranians, then we can use these third parties, these British, to then use the money and some of the weapons to send to the Contras, but the weapons can't be American weapons, so they have to be Soviet weapons. Oh, this gets really crazy. Yeah. So where do they get Soviet weapons to sell the Iranians and to give to the Contras? Well, there's a Palestinian, Soviet-controlled Palestinian drug trafficker and arms dealer, and his name is Mansour al-Qassar, and his family, the Qassar family, is they're in this drug dealing, money laundering, gun running business. And the British recruit him. Some think they recruited him in Denmark. Well, okay, but he's working for the Russians and he's working for the British? Mm-hmm. Who's he really working for? Well, he's got the connections because he's this Middle East arms dealer to get weapons from the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviets knew all along that the British wanted the weapons. They're coming straight from Soviet factories. They're making the weapons they know for the British. They're going to buy them through this guy, al-Qassar. And of course, the problem is the Soviets decide, well, let's let them have the weapons and see what they do, right? I mean, it's like, well, this is too interesting. The British want to buy Soviet weapons. Well, let's let them. And so what happens is the first shipment to Iran, the Israelis find out the shipment is coming to Iran, and they intercept it and capture it, and they brag to the Americans, "Oh, we stopped the Iranians from getting these weapons," thinking they were doing doing a good deed, right? And these Americans and these Brits who were doing this deal is like, "Oh no, you can't! You didn't stop that. What are you doing?" And so this is kind of the typical screw ups of our intelligence people and the British.
Yeah,
and so, of course, eventually,
isn't this sort of an important point to emphasize that some covert ops they have important objectives, but when you start them, there's always a risk of things becoming entangled and going sideways, and it's like some people believe the CIA can do anything at all times. The CIA can do this, CIA can do that. Well, sometimes they can't, and sometimes they try, and sometimes, this gets infiltrated and you don't know whom your partners are working for. So this is something that people should become familiar with, that it's not as simple as the Russian propaganda, for example, makes it out to be, because they will always jump on any case and say things about a case, and it's not a realistic picture.
No, it's not and of course it's we don't have reliable sources on all this. I mean, it's from old spies talking anonymously to journalists, some of it, but there is this one as far as the Iran-Contra. So you have this deal, and it's technically illegal, and there's people and it's William Casey, the head of the CIA, is the kingpin in this thing. He gets brain cancer and dies.
He's not trustworthy. I mean, Casey is weird.
He's part of the Dulles Circle.
He destroyed Angleton's career at CIA counterintelligence. He shoved him under the bus.
You're thinking about William Colby.
Oh, I mean Colby
was the one that destroyed Angleton's career. By the time you have Bill Casey coming in, Colby's already yesterday's news. You've had Admiral Stansfield Turner being head of the CIA under President Jimmy Carter, and of course you have what you have is a series of failures. Of course, in the 1970s, the Nicaraguan revolution, the revolution in Iran, as I mentioned before. But then you have, when you get into this period, this bungling of the British intelligence and the American intelligence in this arms trafficking. And basically, they're not defeating the communists in Africa. They're not really defeating the Sandinista regime either. And you get this story. Now, this book is controversial, and, you can question it. There's questions I have. This is a book it came out in the 1990s, Compromised: Clinton, Bush, and the CIA, how the presidency was co-opted by the CIA, he claims. Now, I think Reid's interpretation is wrong. You have to read the book. If you read what he actually experienced, you realize that Reid isn't a very good analyst, right? He has these raw experiences, but he puts them together backwards. And when you have this larger picture of what goes on, there's clues in here. It's almost 1,000 pages. I think maybe it is 1,000 pages. Very difficult read, very difficult story. But what Terry Reid is he ran the CIA proprietary company that was to send the arms to the Contras. And believe it or not, that company started out in Bill Clinton's Arkansas, and Bill Clinton was recruited by Bill Casey as governor of Arkansas to be part of the money laundering and the movement of the weapons into Nicaragua to supply the Contras with arms. So this is very strange because we know from Bill Clinton's background, he was an anti-war activist. His wife is very far to the left. She worked for the law firm that represented the Black Panthers in California. She's, when I talked to Larry Nichols, he said when he met her, she's wearing "I'm a proud member of the Communist Party" button on her when he met her. When she was First Lady of Arkansas, when he was bringing lobbyists to meet with Bill Clinton. So it's what's really strange is the Clintons have this communist background, and they get people like Anthony Lake who are associated with a communist think tank. These people, a KGB think tank, and of course there's all kinds of things about the Clintons and of course, Bill Clinton went behind the Iron Curtain to Moscow in just the beginning of the winter of 1969 to 70, and then went to Czechoslovakia. And there's stories about his travels back there. There's letters. There's defectors talking about things that went on there, and of course I have, and other people have papers about this. That we're holding on to, but they don't prove anything, but they are very interesting. Yeah. Suggestive that Clinton was a communist. And of course, it's funny that it's typical of someone like Bill Casey, just like Allen Dulles. And we talked before about how Angleton at the end of his life feared that Allen Dulles was under Soviet control. Yeah. That his work with Nazi gold had caused him to fall under that.
And people have to remember now, even though I think Bill Clinton and Hillary, they met at Yale, I believe, right? But so Yale is of course expensive, but at a certain time, Hillary was working, odd jobs to support herself and that. So they kind of, this is kind of indicative of developing a hatred for, Western system and capitalism and not being born into a upper, echelon of society, maybe. So because, they ultimately
Hillary
had
Clinton's from a Chicago Republican family.
Yeah.
She was actually a Goldwater girl when she was younger, but she got radicalized in college. And of course, she became a fan of Saul Alinsky.
Rules for Radicals, right?
Is Rules for Radicals. He dedicates the book to Satan, right, as the first revolutionary. This subtext is clearly Marxist, Leninist, although nobody has ever said that Alinsky belonged to the Communist Party. He didn't have to. He was doing the work of the Communist Party without the label.
We know about the leanings of Karl Marx and Bakunin and some of these other very important occultists in the early socialist movement, right? I mean, they were pretty big on this kind of thinking.
Well, yeah, I mean, they like the symbolism, and so the Clintons. So they're the governor in Arkansas. Clinton's the governor of Arkansas in the 80s, and of course, what Terry Reid said as the head of the CIA proprietary in Arkansas is that Bill Clinton was William Casey, the head of the CIA's fair-haired boy, and I think Casey was a genuine anti-communist. I think he thought he was fighting communism. But I think like many of the people who came out of that Allen Dulles CIA OSS kind of background, there was a kind of rule-breaking culture there, which got these people into trouble. certainly got Casey into trouble. And this is where the bungling begins. When you don't understand what you're doing in clandestine operations, you end up getting owned by the other side. And here's what's so scary about this book. So Reed is working in Arkansas with the Clintons, and he's noticing that people around the Clintons are dying in plane accidents. Yeah. He's got a private plane. These guys fly around. They're rich. They're businessmen. And he's noticing these aircraft accidents where people are dying, and he's trying to connect the dots in his head about why are these people dying, and he's realizing that someone's tampering with the aircraft, and he's becoming frightened for himself. And of course, he realizes also, he testifies in here how Clinton is a cocaine user, a serious drug user, and of course a sex addict, and him and his brother.
Didn't he have like a brother who was busted for this?
Yes, well, I mean, there was one time that Clinton was taken, I think it was with his brother, they had OD'd on cocaine. They'd taken so much. And of course, all this stuff is covered up. And of course, I knew journalists back in the late 90s who had interviewed the state troopers who had bodyguarded the Clintons. And the stories they told were horrific.
Wild.
Of how the Clinton, Arkansas was run. It was just a center of, and of course, here's the problem with these dirty CIA operations is that they're just ideal for being captured by the Soviet Union, by the KGB. Yeah. And of course, if we read this correctly, what Terry Reed is saying. So here's what Terry Reed experienced. So as the operation to supply the Contras becomes, and the supply chain goes up to Mena, Arkansas, they're bringing, unbeknownst to Terry Reed, they're bringing drugs from communists in Colombia. And nobody realizes Manuel Noriega, the president of Panama, who is supposed to be an agent recruited by the DIA and is working for the CIA, he's actually a double agent working for Cuba, the communists. Manuel Noriega of Panama. And Panama is like the Switzerland of Latin America, right? It's got all the banking, all the secret banking is going on there. So this is perfect for money laundering. You got this connection to the Netherlands and Antilles. And so you've got all this money laundering of this red cocaine money, really. And of course, because the George Bush trusts Noriega, and of course Noriega is in a prison in the United States to this day, his lips are sealed because of the way the KGB was trying to dirty the Reagan administration and the CIA because they were doing something that was basically forbidden to begin with. They were supplying the Contras when Congress had said no. You can't do it. You have to let the communists take over Nicaragua. And so it's like the Soviets are like, well, yeah, let them have the guns. Let's see where they go. Basically, the Russians were setting up the Reagan administration, the CIA, George Bush, and this is how bad it gets because you've got these people who are double agents working ultimately for Moscow.
I mean, if people back then, in the 80s, if they had properly remembered the Angleton era of CIA counterintelligence, I mean, they would have remembered the infiltration problem, and they would have remembered that not all the big moles had been caught. So if you proceed with certain operations, I mean, you got to step up your game, or you'll be reading about it in the newspapers.
Well, so what happens to Terry Reed? And again, I show this book. It's something you got to study. What happens is that Terry Reed, they end up moving his operation to Mexico. So he's got his warehouse there, and they're doing it from Mexico. So they're not doing it from American soil. They don't want to compromise it, but there's still some kind of traffic up to Bill Clinton's Arkansas. So anyway, what happens is that suddenly you get a CIA supply plane supposedly shot down over Nicaragua, right? And this is like in the beginning of this Reagan second term. And he gets shot down over Nicaragua, supposedly, and they capture, everybody's alive except one guy parachutes out named Hassenfuss. And he ends up admitting, the CIA is supplying arms to the Contras. I'm one of the people doing it, and Daniel Ortega releases Hassenfuss. Well, what Terry Reed finds out after this happens, and everybody's like, what's going on? We got outed, whatever. Amram Nir of Mossad, a high-level Mossad official, comes to see Terry Reid in Mexico, and he says, we've got a problem. The guy that's running your operation, Felix Rodriguez, is a KGB double agent. Now, this is in this book. Now, Felix Rodriguez recently appeared on, the Danny Jones podcast. And it was very fascinating to listen to him. He's a very persuasive guy. He's an anti-communist guy. But Terry Reid, this Mossad Amram Nir comes to Terry Reid and says, no, Felix Rodriguez was captured around the time of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. When he was incarcerated, they flipped him and sent him back. He was a CIA guy, a Cuban guy working contract for the CIA back then, ended up in the CIA. And of course, this is the claim that Terry Reid is making. Now, is it true? Well, it's fascinating because here's what happens next. Amram Nir says, we know that Hassan Fous was recruited by Rodriguez to crash the plane because there were Jewish doctors, Israeli Mossad agent doctors, that did the autopsies on the bodies from the crash, and they were all murdered, sound familiar, before they were put on the plane. We saw this in The Conspiracy and Death of Lin Biao, a fake plane crash. And that was an intentional attempt to expose the whole operation, bring down President Reagan, and of course, George Bush is working. I mean, Felix Rodriguez is going in and out of George Bush's office. George Bush has the back channel to the English gun runners, right? The English intelligence. Yeah. They're doing the deals with the Iranians. This is how Iran gets caught up in this. And they're buying, through Al-Qasar, they're buying Soviet weapons right out of Soviet factories. And the Russians they know about it and they're letting it happen. Why are they letting it happen? Because they spring this trap, which becomes the Iran-Contra scandal. And so Terry Reid does not believe Amram Nir when he says they're moving cocaine through the supply network. They're corrupting all the CIA people, and the CIA people that were killed on the plane were the ones that wouldn't go along with it. Right? They had to murder their own CIA people because the KGB was taking over the CIA operation with double agents, according to Amram Nir. Well, according to Terry Reid, because Amram Nir died in a plane crash. Amram Nir was scared to death, according to Terry Reid, of getting in small planes because he thought he had this premonition of being killed in a small plane crash. Apparently he was, according to Reid. But so Reid says, look, let's go to my warehouse here, just outside Mexico City here, or wherever his warehouse was. Let's go to it and look. And his warehouse was full of cocaine, so Terry Reid had to go into hiding. But it doesn't end there. He went into hiding by putting his family in an SUV and going to different state parks or national parks for quite some period of time. When he comes back to Arkansas, Bill Clinton has his police, the state police, charge Terry Reid with stealing his own aircraft. He had his aircraft stolen, and he had claimed the insurance money, and they claimed that he stole his own aircraft. And they tried to put him in prison and shut him up, and he got off that charge. But isn't it funny? So Bill Clinton's trying to silence Terry Reid and put him in prison on this other charge, which was fake. And it's all in this book. And of course, there's this strange moment where Terry Reid meets one of the top KGB guys in Mexico, and he seems to know everything that's going on. And he walks away and he goes, this KGB guy seems to be one step ahead of us. And of course, they are. And of course, when it's compromised, who's compromised? Clinton is part of this. Bush is part of this. These are going to be the next two presidents of the United States.
Oh, boy.
What is going on, right? And this is when the Soviet Union goes through its collapse, right at this moment where they've got their hooks in these guys, especially Bill Clinton, who becomes the president right after the fall of the Soviet Union. This is really disturbing. I mean, you can draw different conclusions from it. It's, what I'm saying is it all worries me. And this story of the Iran-Contra, I don't think we have the true story. And of course, you've got famously, and I met him, Konstantin Menges, who had been the head of the CIA for Latin America when this unfolded. He'd been State Department head of the Latin American division before that. In the second term, he was a true Reaganite. His book is Inside the National Security Council. He doesn't not give a very good report about Oliver North. about Secord, about Secretary of State George Shultz. He said in the second Reagan administration, you have a lot of people who believed in anti-communism were sort of eliminated from the administration by then. He was one of the few holdovers. And you have people in here who are really liberals and want to accommodate the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean,
you're not going to read this anywhere else,
I mean, right? In the 80s, or let's say late 80s, this is when Helmut Kohl got busted. You know, the German chancellor. Maybe people remember him, the big guy, you know, the fat guy. He was sort of this anti-communist, you know, very conservative guy, pro-America and all that. But he had a system of, you know, funny money. You know, this was like a thing that had supported his whole career. And he was hooked up with the younger Flick. You know, the old Flick was really big in the Nazi era. He had a guy from the Brauchitsch family. You know, they had a famous general or infamous general in the Nazi era. So he thought he was secure with his guys and his funny money, but one of his people, very close people, was a Stasi spy, and he relayed all these secrets to East Germany, and they made a deal with him. You know, this came out years later. They made a
deal with Kohl.
Exactly. So, I mean, I suspect that...
So there's an allegation that Kohl had a back channel deal with the communists.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is pretty much known now, but it's assumed that one of the first things that Helmut Kohl did was talk to his American contacts and confess, you know, and say, I screwed up, you know, how do we handle this? So people made this decision. The communists would stay quiet about this whole money thing, and in return, the communists would get new loans and more appeasement. You know, the whole East German government would get a new lifeline, so to say, in terms of finance and appeasement. So this was all happening in the 80s or late 80s.
Yeah, you know, it reminds me, I wrote a piece about the Nasser and the Russian attempt to take over the Middle East through Egypt in my last posting. And one of the expressions that I read was what American diplomats observing Soviet attempts to colonize Egypt and Syria, and they said, you can't buy an Arab, you can only rent him. and I think that could apply to all the people that the Soviets try to buy, whether it's Kohl or to try to compromise people, the Bush or the Clintons or whoever. Even if they are at one point true believers and become cynics later, is the problem of powerful, sneaky, narcissistic people is that, you know, they don't have any loyalty. And if you use them as instruments and you involve them in your capers, you're sort of training them to betray you in the end. Maybe some of that has occurred.
And also with Helmut Kohl, I mean, he was credited for, you know, handling a situation right at the end of the Cold War, you know, German reunification, just getting all this handled, you know, to have a unified Germany, remain inside of NATO. So he's credited with that. But, you know, his people, you know, Helmut Kohl's people that he trusted with his back channel money, these people had connections to Britain, you know, after the war, you know, with the British zone, the British occupation zone, and the British setting up various organizations here. Now, the Brauchitsch family, they have, you know, British ties and so on. So it's possible there was maybe there was another breach on the British side, because we know the British were thoroughly compromised by the Soviets. So maybe there was more than one leak that became a problem for
there may have been a playback on the Russians,
and he was
too.
the guy before I forget this, and he was the guy who nurtured the career of Angela Merkel, who grew up in communism, because
who
he gave her a
the
ministry.
What? Oh, the career.
The career of Angela Merkel, who's going to release her memoirs in the fall of this year, and because nobody could quite understand why did Helmut Kohl give her a ministry. In his government. Everybody's like, why her? And it's like, oh, just take her, she's gonna do well, and then she became this big thing. So maybe that was part of a deal he had with the communists, some sort, because
sure, because the communists want to place their people in the key positions for their future attempt at controlling countries. And this is, you look at the complexities. I mean, we don't know what the real relationship between some of these people and Soviet intelligence was or is. We only know that the defector Stanislav Lunev told me. I said, I asked him about the Clintons, and I said, how does that work if you have somebody who reaches the level of presidency or a cabinet level position who's someone that you'd recruited earlier? And he said, oh, no, we cannot refer to them as an agent. Once they reach a certain rank, they're not agents anymore. They're friends. Mm-hmm. And we treat them as equals, and you don't try to boss them. And I think they learned that. And I think we've mentioned it on the show before. So it's complicated. And of course, we don't know to what extent there's playback. There's also this weird story about a super secret, American intelligence agency that supposedly came in immediately after Watergate and took over and started to play the Soviets back. And that this super secret, they said, why get rid of the CIA? It's all penetrated. Let it operate. Let the Russians think that's what we use. Time. We're going to create this super secret, when supposedly George Bush was the guy that launched it just before he became head of the CIA. I don't know if I believe this story. It comes from someone who was, again, a former intelligence person who was diagnosed with a mental illness, right? Had an explanation for it. He knew things he shouldn't have known. Mm-hmm. But you just don't know what, and obviously, so I don't, a lot of people, I run this by people and they say, no, Jeff, can't be true.
There's one. I think there's one comparison that I think you can draw, which is sort of an accepted chapter of history, which was the British deception, this large scale British deception against the Nazis, because that started fairly early. I mean, we talked about this on the show when Winston Churchill in 1920 or 21, he had this big newspaper commentary published where he said, well, the good Jews are the Zionists, who love us, and the bad Jews are the Bolsheviks. So there's kind of an example, I think, of a long-term deception operation where you have a secret structure. I mean, of course, this was inside of the aristocracy and some selected people, and this was separated from the parliament, separated from most of these regular channels.
Let me make a comment on that. There's a difference between Britain and the U.S. and Germany. And the difference is that in Britain, unlike the United States and Germany, Britain has these laws. Britain has the most restrictive anti-secrecy or
official
official secrecy laws. Yeah. That you can be locked up and put away, and they really, look, this is a book, Spycatcher, written by Peter Wright. He was a former head of MI5, which is like the British FBI, British Counterintelligence, Domestic Service.
Oh, they came after him.
What's that?
They came after him, right?
They came after him. He ended up living in Tasmania, right? And they hounded him in the Australian courts because Tasmania is a province of Australia. And of course, Peter Wright, this book, you can't find it in Britain. It's banned. They prevented this book from being published in Great Britain. And of course, we're in the scandals of the 1980s. This was, I think, 1987, the Spycatcher scandal. Peter Wright was the former deputy head of the British Secret Service who believed that his boss, Sir Roger Hollis, was a Soviet agent. And he published it right here. And of course, he knew Angleton. He describes Angleton as a Cassandra who's saying the end is coming and we've lost. We've lost it to the Soviets. They're always one step ahead of us. And he admits in the book the Soviets are always one step ahead. He talks about working with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian and so on. And it's one of the first stories in the book about how the Soviets knew in advance everything they were doing. How did they know? And of course, that's the real dilemma. And of course, the Spycatcher scandal, Margaret Thatcher, an anti-communist conservative, she's all against this guy. You can't say these secrets. So and of course, so Britain's dirty laundry is dirty. This colonial power Britain, they have a, perfidious Albion. They have this pretty nasty history, Lawrence of Arabia and the rest, and having homosexuals in MI6 to be special agents to compromise people. I mean, the British were the dirtier, and look at what they did in Ireland, clamping down on the Irish in the Irish revolt. They sent out teams of assassins just to murder people. The British practice is pretty rough.
In Britain, if you were, or if you are kind of if you're a normal official, normal intelligence officer from a normal family, they can get you. I mean, they just have the Official Secrets Act and they do what they want. But once there is a problem in the higher families, if there's a Lord Louis Mountbatten with Soviet contacts and he's messing things up for NATO, you can't really touch Lord Mountbatten. People knew he was overpromoted. People knew he was suspicious in his private life. But you couldn't really get him because if you're a member of the royal family, they are sort of above the normal laws.
They're untouchable.
Yeah, and the spies were regarded in Britain as crown agents or crown servants. So you're sworn to the crown, not necessarily the parliament. This is sort of the hierarchy that they have. And I think
because the king is the symbol of the country, and so it's your loyalty is to the king, to the monarchy.
So when the Soviets were looking for traitors in their own ranks, were giving information to the CIA, the Soviets, they could go after anybody. I mean, it doesn't matter who that was. They could surveil, they could catch them, and they could interrogate them any way they liked. But in the West it was different, and in Britain it was even more different, because in Britain you can't just grab a member of the royal family and just interrogate him and torture him and all that stuff. So this became sort of a huge issue in Britain, and by Britain having this problem, this became a problem for Germany because a lot of our structures were set up by the British. I think our domestic intelligence service was created by the British. Lord Ivar.
There's Galen organization, of course, which was really set up by the Americans.
Yeah, and I think it was Sir Ivan Kirkpatrick, who was related to the throne, and he set up the domestic intelligence service here. So if the Britons have a problem, we have a problem. And I think this also extends to America. If the Brits have a serious problem, America has a serious problem. And we know about, the Klaus Fuchs atomic spy. We know about some other people. And Philby, Philby became a problem for the Americans, ultimately.
Yeah. No, it's a very serious thing. And of course, the Americans just did not have the experience. And when you've got people, the allegation, not saying it's true, but it's interesting that the head of the OSS during World War II, William Donovan, had been recruited as a British agent, compromised in World War I. I mean, if you're loyal to your country, you can't be recruited by an Allied service.
Yeah.
That makes you that's treason, even if it's an Allied service. And the same thing has been alleged about the Dulles in World War I. I think I maybe misspoke last time, but in Alan Dulles was an agent in World War I. He got recruited by an Austrian honey trap, turned, and I think it was the British got him out of it. And he became, according to this story, if we believe it, he became a British agent. So that's Alan Dulles. But then Alice Dulles was so irresponsible in his sexual behavior, he could have easily been compromised by the Russian, GRU at any time during his time in Switzerland in World War II. And then you have this issue we should revisit about There were the Nazis that the West controlled and the Nazis the Soviets controlled, and there was a battle over acquiring Nazis, because remember, the Nazis were spying on the West and the East, and both sides wanted to acquire the Nazi networks. And it doesn't matter, you can say, these are evil people, we shouldn't use Nazis, but it's a life and death struggle between East and West, and you want to get your Nazi scientists and spies better than the other side gets.
And we talked about these examples of politicians being compromised and being possibly recruited in the 80s, for example. And there's another example. For example, you have the later German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. Now, Gerhard Schröder was always known for his dislike for NATO. I mean, when he was a younger politician, he talked trash about NATO, and this would have put him on the radar of the British and the Americans, because if you have a rising political star in Germany who says these things, this already meets the threshold, especially for the British and the Americans, because he's not an American citizen. He doesn't have American constitutional protections because he's a German, right? So if he was placed on the NSA list, if he was placed on, the surveillance list of the GCHQ or whatever, they could have monitored him, right? But he was rising up the ranks, and he ultimately became chancellor, because then Helmut Kohl, by the time he got into another scandal with funny money, this was about the entire Conservative Party. So then we knew that big corporations, names that Americans even know, these corporations, they've given money, put money into certain places, and that money probably reappeared in the coffers of the Conservative Party, and somehow it leaked. We can probably guess how or why. And so this was kind of a big blow to the Conservative Party. And so then came the big day of the Social Democrats, who were always very pro-Russia, and we got this new chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, who was a big fan of the Nord Stream pipeline. He's really close to Vladimir Putin, and by close, I mean close, right? He wanted to adopt Russian children. He gets preferential treatment when he visits Russia. He started to work with a Russian company after he was done as chancellor, a gas company, right? Or a gas oil company of the Russians. So this is a former German chancellor. I mean, people still get crazy about, this little thing with Trump and the Russians and that little thing, with Trump and the Russians. You got to look at Gerhard Schröder. But this was insane. And he was kind of that guy who was now in control of the unified or reunified Germany. And the big thing was, we love the Russians. We want to help the Russians. We're going to buy all that gas, and we're going to make these new pipelines, and maybe we buy electricity from them. We shut down our, nuclear power plants, and we're going to buy Russian power, no matter how they make it.
Maybe now's the moment to mention Willy Brandt, the Social Democratic Chancellor, and the scandal that brought him down, and his connections with Soviet intelligence, or his associates' connections with them. Let's go over that in the Ostpolitik idea. Let's go over that so people can kind of understand what's going on in Germany, because Germany doesn't only have conservative politicians before the end of the Cold War, they also have Mr. Brandt.
Yeah, so now Willy Brandt, he was he was a guy who has a past, where we don't know what side he was working for. So, this guy was, he came from a leftist household, and he got entangled with communists. And his real name is not even Willy Brandt. His real name is Herbert Frahm. And, during, the Nazi era, he was a communist underground activist. I kid you not. That was Willy Brandt, aka, or really Herbert Frahm. So he was using various cover names, aliases, and he was traveling around Europe, and he was hooking up different communist groups. At some point he worked with the Soviets, and he worked with some other groups, and it's all very, very shadowy. And then, so after the war, he got himself he got himself recruited by the Americans, the CIC. It was called the Counterintelligence Corps. The CIC was tasked with rebuilding Germany and finding out suitable people to use and just preventing, dangerous Nazis from slipping, through the cracks. And so he offered his services to the CIC. And so that's when, especially the British as an occupation force, they tried to rebuild the Social Democrats, right? So because, the Social Democrats they've been very much pro-Russia for a very long time, and now it was the era of rebuilding that party. Now we know the British are compromised, so that doesn't spell, that spells doom right away. And so at some point the CIC was ended because that's when, when the CIA was around and they sort of, relegated certain operations to new services. And so this was kind of the situation in Germany. If you were a politician, you had to be in the 40s, in the late 40s and early 50s. If you wanted to be a successful politician, you had to be associated with the CIC or British intelligence. So this is how he made his career. But you could never really tell what he did during the war. So he in the 30s, he was traveling all over Europe using fake names. He was traveling to Spain, Civil War, and he was traveling to Northern Europe. And his KGB file begins in the year 1936. This is when they started to work with him and list him. And so we actually have some files now. I mean, there's new studies. For example, there's a new study out on his association with the CIC, of course. We have at least part of his KGB file. And so in 1941, Mr. Brandt, whatever you want to call him, he was at the Soviet embassy in Stockholm, talking to Soviet agents, and he was promising information about German troops and operations in Norway. And we know that he signed he signed a document that he received money for his services. Now, of course, back at the time, the Soviets knew he was also working with British intelligence. He was also working with American intelligence. But the question is, what was his main allegiance to? What was his primary association, right? And
but
now, of course,
he mainly, his policies mainly were helpful to the USSR, weren't they?
Oh yeah.
That's pretty clear. You look at the result.
Yeah.
Who benefits? Cui bono? Who benefits?
Yeah.
From Brandt's policies.
And we know that when he became really successful in politics later on, the people around him, they had significant back channels to Soviet East Germany. They had guys like they had a pretty decent network, so to say. And one of these guys, Egon Bahr, he was actually mentioned recently by Vladimir Putin in the interview with Tucker Carlson.
What did Putin say? I did seem to remember
he just name drops Egon Bahr, Putin does, and he says, well, here's an example of a good German, doing good things. Now, he was called Tricky Egon for a reason, right? And now we have some new studies based on Stasi files.
So tell, since most of our listeners are Americans, I suspect, explain the whole story of Egon Bahr, if you could, for our listeners.
Well, I have a lot of material in one of my books about this, because we have new Stasi files. We have decoded databases, because at some point the Stasi was doing stuff on computers. And they did a database migration, and we have a copy of the migration database. So now we can piece these things together, and we know who Egon Bahr was talking to. So he's representing the West German Social Democrats, and he and his very close circle of people, they were talking to very specific high-ranking Stasi agents. Now, of course, if anybody had figured this out, that there was this back channel, Egon Bahr and these other people, they could have just said, well, we need back channels. I mean, you can't fault us for, talking to the other side. And of course, if you have like this connection to British intelligence, if you have a connection to American intelligence, you could share a little bit here and now and then, and say, well, we heard stuff from, the communists, and this is what we know. So when you do that, when you share some stuff with the Brits and the Americans, they think they can trust that person, that social democrat. But who are they really working for, right? Because there was so many decisions being made at the time, in that Cold War phase. Many decisions that really, really benefited the Soviet Union because they were desperate for technology. The Soviets were desperate to sell their oil and their gas to West Germany and to other countries in Europe. So there's even from 1981, there's an American intelligence assessment that you can now read because it's declassified. And these Americans talk about the gas pipelines that already existed and the new pipelines that were being prepared. And so this report says this is dangerous because this is how the Soviets make real money. They can get foreign currency, hard currency, and with that currency, the Soviets can improve their military and they can buy more stuff, and that becomes a problem for America, right? And it was these guys, these social democrats, that did the most to make these pipelines happen, to start new pipeline deals, and to buy that Russian gas. Now, this is when the Germans started to heat their homes with gas that we actually have ourselves, but we're not able to get to the gas because fracking is the devil, according to Russian propaganda. So we had to buy it. We used to have oil. Oil-based heating systems, but now people were converting to gas. West German industry was converting to gas, right? For as a power source, and this gas more and more came from the Soviet Union. Now, this is not just a problem for us. This was a problem for the rest of the world, especially America, because how are the Soviets going to pay for all this stuff? Of course, they need to have these pipelines, and the way these deals function, and this was even carried over into the 90s then, of course, we, the Germans, we actually loaned the money for the project to the Russians. We sold the Russians with our own money, the money that came from us. We sold them the pipes, the steel pipes used for these pipelines, and we sold them the compressors, and we sold them all the gear to actually run this thing, to run these pipelines, because the Soviets couldn't even do it themselves. So this is kind of the royal deal.
Yeah, let's talk for a minute about the Chernobyl and the effect on power in Europe. It's very interesting to me that Chernobyl, what was that, in 1986?
86.
That you have, and it's May. It's around the same time as the May victory celebrations in the Soviet Union. And what's funny is that you have an unusual weather condition at that time. Usually the prevailing winds would carry any radiation east. But at that time, the winds could carry it into Scandinavia and parts of Europe, this radioactivity. And so you have the Chernobyl meltdown, which was a catastrophe in nuclear power. But if you look at Europe's development of energy, as the Reagan administration was encouraging them to build nuclear power and saying, don't take this Russian or Soviet natural gas. Don't take the natural gas. Become independent, because if you did, and they were saying this in the Nixon administration when it was first being booted around, like, oh wow, they found natural gas in the Soviet Union. This would solve, Europe's energy problems. It's like, no, build nuclear. But isn't it true that after Chernobyl, it kind of put the kibosh on nuclear power in a lot of European countries because of that? And it really had a powerful effect in causing the European dependence on Soviet natural gas. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's. I think I share that suspicion, that opinion as well, because we know that Russia was going to ditch communism anyway. This has been, of course, the long-term plan. And so when Chernobyl happened, and then a couple of years later, the Soviet Union was officially done, people interpreted this as a connection. So they messed up with the reactor. They did this exercise where they were going to bring down.
They actually blew up the reactor by the exercise. I mean,
exactly.
It was as if this guy comes in, he's an expert, he's saying, push the reactor past this point. And people are saying, we can't really do that, can we? Yeah, push it. And they knew they had a thing with this reactor that when you had started to shut it down, it would actually, it would heat up more initially. So that if you pushed it past a certain point, you were going to blow it up, right?
This was
they did that on purpose.
This was a cheaper way of making a nuclear reactor. So they had this graphite, that was later found, close in pieces. That's when they knew that there was an actual explosion, because they brought down the power output of the reactor, but they were missing some things, and there was a buildup of neutrons or whatever. And at some point, this thing spiraled out of control. So it was the power that was generated was way higher than the normal output, and it was too late. So they tried what they could to stop this reaction, but this thing blew. And so people made this connection of saying, well, Chernobyl really showed that the Soviet system was trash, and then the whole world could see it was trash, and that led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. But that's a dangerous connection to make. Now, at the time, or on that day, or around that day when it happened, they spent like 20 seconds on Soviet news, in the evening news. They talked for 20 seconds about it and said, there's been an incident, there's a bit of a problem here. And when everybody in the world saw that this was a major issue that was threatening all of Europe, then you saw a big silence from the German Green Party. Right? So these were the guys who were always hopping mad about the ozone layer and industry and everything. But when this mega catastrophe happened, they were really quiet. And the Green Party at that time in Germany, West Germany, they were so pro-Russia. They were visiting the Soviet Union, and they were giving these press conferences, not in the German embassy, but someplace else. And they really loved the Soviet Union. And these green activists, they were surveilling military infrastructure in West Germany. They were just figuring out, the main routes and everything. So very, very radical movement at the time. And so this whole event was then later, this was reframed as the call to end nuclear power in the unified Germany, and they were adding a anti-capitalist message to it, because they were saying it's irresponsible to do it, and because it's capitalism, and so let's just end it. And of course, because of Chernobyl. So this is how the Green Party in the 90s, then the Green Party and the Social Democrats, they tried their most to change the whole energy supply of Germany, the reunified Germany, and the new pipelines. And they were actually considering, this was in a French intelligence report that got leaked, there was actually the idea of adding massive power lines basically alongside the Nord Stream gas pipelines. So we could not just get gas from the former Eastern Bloc, we could also get electrical power. And of course, this power source may have been nuclear, but the Social Democrats wouldn't care, and the Greens wouldn't care. As long as it's not on our soil and it's controlled by the Russians, they were fine with it.
And of course, the Russians could turn that power off. It's an interesting question about Chernobyl, which happened, and this is a year after Gorbachev takes power in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev came in March of 1985, and he was exactly as Golitsyn had described in a 1982 manuscript that became his 1984 book, New Lies for Old, that a Soviet Dubček, that is Dubček, who liberalized Czechoslovakia, and then they went and invaded it, was a communist liberalizer, communism with a human face. And this is what Gorbachev is trying to promise and trying to bring. He meets with Reagan at Reykjavik in Reagan's second term, and Reagan says no to him. I am not going to make a deal with you. But then he ends up making the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement. And this opens the way then, when George H.W. Bush becomes president, to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of all these East European regimes. And then finally, at the end of 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Yeah, so we arrive at the end. But in the background of this, I want to emphasize for everyone, is this corruption within the intelligence services of the West, with penetration of those intelligence services by double agents from the KGB. As you know, it's just a testimony from Terry Reid, the testimony from John Loftus's people about this gun-running, dirty British business. And by the way, they wanted, if anything went wrong, they're going to blame the Israelis. The Israelis are the gun runners. The Israelis are the bad guys. Yeah. That was the way it was set up.
And there's like when the wall came down, the famous Berlin Wall came down. I mean, this was almost perfect theater, because there was a date set for this new rule that the Soviet slaves could actually leave Eastern Germany and go to the West. So there was this date set when this new rule applies. So this very important guy goes on television, and he apparently fumbled it up, but maybe that was intentional. So he said, like, on television, well, this new travel thingy-majingy is going to be this rule is going to be active, like, I think maybe right away or something. And that's when people started to go, wow, oh my God, we're going to rush to the wall, to the border. And, this is when the famous television images happened, of these people knocking down the wall. Of course, it wasn't that simple, because it was like a double wall with a minefield in between and then stuff like that. But, this is when this big event happened. Like, it seemed so inept what the communists were doing on the surface, right? Fumbling up the most important thing in communist East German history, right? I mean, he was supposed to go on television and say, by tomorrow or by the day after tomorrow, this new rule will take effect, so you can start, packing a suitcase or whatever, and it's only on that day that you can actually cross the border. But he fumbled it up strangely and said, I think right away, maybe, and then everybody...
Well, yeah, they were planning to have passports and everything made up. They were going to make it a different deal, but people spontaneously got that idea, and they went out and they basically broke it open. And the communists decided to go with it because they had this plan, and what they underestimated was how excited people were to not be repressed anymore, to do what they wanted, to travel or to move around, just to cross that line.
Yeah, but of course, by that time, at the time, when this was when Vladimir Putin was stationed in East Germany, with the KGB. He also had a Stasi document with him. He was also attached to that. And so by the time everything went crazy, this internal stuff was running like clockwork. They were burning the stuff, burning the files that they didn't even need anymore, because they had long sent copies to Moscow or St. Petersburg. So they were burning the last stacks of documents, and they were closing up shop, but they made it look like chaos. They made it look like, it was a bit of chaos, of course, but, they made it look like, oh, this all happened out of nowhere. We were surprised by this, and some people were storming the local Stasi offices and grabbing files and just trashing the place. It was supposed to look like chaos.
Alex, is that when you look at the other East European countries like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, you find out that more than a year before the fall of the Berlin Wall, Moscow was calling for all their key files to be sent to Moscow, as if Moscow knows those files are not going to be able to be kept in those countries anymore.
Yeah, and
it's like they knew. It's like, well, how did they know?
Yeah, and
right?
the East German leadership, they knew that Moscow was calling the shots, obviously. So this is when some people in the administration, they felt surprised because they were supposed to feel that surprise. And but with the Russians, it was a whole different ballgame. And they immediately started to flood us in the West with spies, more spies. And at the time, the West German domestic intelligence service was absolutely tiny. People can look this up, how crazy tiny it was. So imagine they were already out of their depth during the Cold War, and now there's like hundreds of thousands and even millions of people.
And the Stasi was huge, and the number of agents it had was massive.
And we still don't have all the Stasi files of operations and assets, because what we got was, the Rosenholz file data set. Then we got this electronic database, which was not complete, which was not fully detailed about all the operations and assets. So now you have this tiny intelligence agency now swarmed with problems that they cannot possibly handle. So how do you deal with that? I mean, it's like we got reunified. Yes, we remained a member of NATO. Yes. But how many problems did we get? How many spy problems did we get from that? So it's not like the communist Germany was gone. It was like it flooded into us.
And of course, at the end of the Cold War, when this Gorbachev is giving away East Germany, and these revolutions are happening, and I think we've gone into this before. There's Robert Bukarev's documentary where he interviews Czech STB, that's the Czech KGB officers, about how the orders came from Moscow to make this revolution, and it was faked, and they wanted Havel. Havel was a backup guy that they wanted to use, that they felt confident in him. Same thing with the hole in the flag. Andrei Codrescu's account of the overthrow of Nicolae Ceausescu, he says, the evidence says that the order came from Moscow to overthrow Ceausescu. It wasn't a spontaneous revolution at all. And then you've got the accusations against Lech Walesa in Poland. And I heard Fighting Solidarity people say, we know he's a secret police agent. And of course, it was revealed then in court. Later, a UB agent, that's the Polish KGB, in court said, yeah, Lech Walesa was one of ours, was one of our agents.
And so,
right?
And so then you had like the Dresden Bank, okay, former communist territory. The Dresden Bank became so important because of its connection to the Social Democrats and also the pipelines. And then you had the later chancellor.
So the Dresden Bank had a lot of dealings with the East.
Oh yeah. So then Gerhard Schröder was kind of involved in all this, and then you had like this former Stasi guy, Mr. Warnick, who was also tied to these gas deals. And so then it became the question of, when did Gerhard Schröder, who became chancellor, when did he first meet Vladimir Putin, and when did Matthias Warnick first meet Vladimir Putin?
And when did Angela Merkel first meet him?
So they told these stories, these people, this was when we first met in that year and blah, blah, blah. But then, of course, investigative journalists like Jürgen Roth, who is now dead, unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago, he was questioning these timelines. He was saying, well, according to my sources, it looks more like the first meeting was maybe further back then. So then, this investigative journalist...
So they're lying about how long they knew him.
Well, this investigative journalist got sued, and he always got into trouble for his books because he was questioning these timelines, right? And now, of course, with all that's happened since, there was an interview with Schröder in the New York Times. This was in 2022 or 23. This was already into the Ukraine war, right? And so these, I think, New York Times journalists, they sit down with Mr. Schröder, and he drinks wine a lot, apparently. And so he makes all these excuses. He makes all these excuses and says that, well, we consider ourselves lucky that the Soviet Union was gone, and this was very much the result of hard negotiations. And so basically this is the best deal that we could get. So the Soviets removed their tanks and their troops and everything. We get a reunified Germany. But, the energy. So we had to buy the energy because by buying Russian energy, we actually show them that we mean well. And so we can have this peace in Europe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is in 1997, when NATO expanded, a lot of American officials were debating this because they did the calculations. They knew how expensive it would be to properly defend Eastern Europe. So there was some differing opinions. And so they finally came up with this deal with the Russians, right? So this was like the famous 1997 deal that these pro-Russian guys don't want to talk about. This is when Russia signed a contract, not hearsay, not old promises, whatever, an actual contract where the Russians admitted they could not prevent other countries from joining any defense pact, right? Like NATO. So
and in fact, Boris Yeltsin and Gorbachev both asked if Moscow could belong to NATO.
Yeah.
And of course, you talk about that. If you imagine you have an alliance made to defend against Russia and Russia's in it, well, what on earth happens to the alliance if Russia's in it?
Right. And then they came up with this weird contract, this weird deal, where these former communist countries, like Poland, right? So Poland could join NATO, but there was a limitation to this. Poland and these other countries, they could not build up significant forces, right?
Right. Just like Germany, by the way, Germany also agreed that its army would be limited in size.
Oh, yeah. So we destroyed our armed forces. And so this is when the Polish delegation freaked out, because they thought, are we NATO members or are we second-class or third-class NATO members?
Yeah.
What is
this?
There's
a treaty, by the way, called the Conventional Forces in Europe Agreement, which, by the way, the Russians have never kept. They used the First and Second Chechen Wars as an excuse not to keep it, and now, of course, they've broken out of it. They're not adhering to it openly.
Yeah, so this is kind of like this craziness that happened in the 90s, because the general opinion was communism was gone. It's never going to return. So we're dealing with a new Russia, a new group, guys like Sobchak and Putin, who apparently pretended to be part of a long-running conservative underground in Russia. And they were making all this noise about the return of the Orthodox Church, and these Russian guys are living in palaces now. Some historic palaces, the old Russia is back, and all that noise. And this is exactly what many people in Europe wanted to hear. There's a story out, for example. This is when one of Putin's guys, I think this was even in the 90s or maybe a bit later, this is when one of Putin's guys was traveling around Germany in the north, the Uckermark, for example. This is where Angela Merkel lives, by the way, and she's going to release her memoirs soon. So he was looking around for a place to start a Russian Orthodox church, right? And he just happened to find this place right next to Angela Merkel, right next to some other important people. So they got money from Russian companies, and they started this church or monastery or whatever you want to call it, building this thing up. And even Angela Merkel's father was involved, because he was a church guy under communism, of course. So they all.
But he wasn't Eastern Orthodox.
No.
It was really weird. I mean, Eastern Orthodox, of course, if you talk to Konstantin Preobrazhensky, former KGB officer, he wrote about this and has talked about the Russian Orthodox Church is a front for Russian intelligence and subversion.
Yeah, and so
around the world.
Some of the people involved in this new church or monastery, they were monitored by intelligence services, different ones. They were saying, these people are potentially dangerous. What are you doing here? Why are you making this church right next to where, former Chancellor Angela Merkel lives? And I suspect when her memoirs come out in the fall, I suspect she's going to make a great deal about her supposed Christianity, because right when she became Chancellor, I think in 2005 or 2006, she started to promote herself as a Christian, right? Now, she grew up in communism, so her religion was communism, of course. But then she started to say, well, I'm really a Christian, and this is really important to me. And she's not going to be so overt about it like some of these Bavarian politicians, some of these other politicians, but it's really, really important to her, right? And this is how she's going to frame her entire policies by saying, well, I let 1 million refugees in because of Jesus, or I was, dealing with the Russians because of Jesus, right? Because of, Jesus' love and everything, right? So this is how she's going to frame it. And
her book is coming out later this year.
Later this year in the fall, 700 pages of that nonsense.
Oh my.
And when she was becoming a thing in politics, and I just mentioned it before in this episode, Helmut Kohl, who was compromised, right? Helmut Kohl promoted her career, and everybody thought, why her? And he said, just trust me on this, just use her. And, she was becoming a big thing, but people around her were exposed one after the other as former Stasi assets, but not her. She told the story more than once that in her university career under communism, she was approached, she says, by someone who tried to recruit her for the Stasi, but she gave that excuse of, no, I'm really timid and I'm really stupid. I can't keep secrets. I'm not good at this. I'm just not the kind of person for that. And according to her, that was the end of it. Right? So this is kind of the personnel that was already created in the 80s.
And yet she was promoted into politics, into this position. Yeah, she's stupid and she can't keep secrets, and she's the Chancellor of Germany, evidently.
And we know that. Yeah.
I mean, this is just inherently improbable.
We know that she got interested in, well, at least interested in politics in the 80s, right? And we know there was a KGB program in the 80s to find young people who could become important in politics later on, grooming people. Now, we don't have any data to say whether or not she was part of that KGB program, but we know this program existed. And this was already in preparation.
She lied about. Now let's see. I mean, we're going into the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism, and Angela Merkel. Didn't Angela Merkel in German politics misrepresent what she was in East Germany, that she was not just in a communist youth organization, she was a leader in one. Well, Isn't that true?
Well, we got more and more information about that over the years. There's a good book. I think in English you would translate it to the First Life of Angela M. That's a very interesting book, and it's very suggestive. They're not making outright accusations, but they're strongly hinting at this stuff over and over again. So she was a model citizen, model communist citizen. She was always the big nerd, always at the forefront. She always wanted to be a big shot, and her career choice initially was a scientist. She was apparently a capable scientist. Now, of course, we know that the Stasi had these special types of dual agent / scientists, right? There was, I think, was it codename Anita or something? So we know that these spies existed that were half spy, half scientist, because they knew what the Stasi was supposed to steal in the West, what would be valuable.
And they wouldn't be fooled by some fake item, right? That was
exactly, because a normal agent is great at recruiting sources on foreign soil and in relaying information, but that spy doesn't know a thing about, quantum physics and all that stuff that she was into.
And what would be really important to steal?
Exactly. So we know that program existed, and her father was involved in the church. Now, he was known as the Red Kazna, because that was the original family name. So he was known to be very loyal to the system. And so the Stasi tried to control the church, the Protestant church in East Germany. And so he did a lot to work with the state to control the church, but it was not so much in the later stages of the Cold War. It was not so much about really outright destroying the church. It was more like controlling it to be used later, because as I'm piecing this stuff together with Putin and the fake conservative underground, they started this in like the 70s or maybe 80s at the latest, by claiming there was this Christian conservative underground in Russia.
A controlled opposition.
Exactly. So like people on the fringes of the Russian system were working against communism, blah, 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 trying to bring it down. So this needed a strong Christian component to it, to be able to make these contacts in the West. And so when all these people around Merkel got busted in the 90s as former Stasis, but she was clean, or on the surface she was clean, there are some suspicions, I think, in that book about her. That's really good. There's some suspicions that she must have done something. Probably. She must have done something to impress the West early on. We don't exactly know what it was. I mean, there's some theories about that, but she must have gotten the trust of the West early on. And then, of course, Helmut Kohl promoted her, and the Americans didn't object that much either, and the British didn't object that much either.
Because so somehow they reinvented her, they packaged her right, and she got accepted.
Yeah, because her father,
as an East German who becomes ultimately the chancellor,
and there's
under the Christian Democratic Union.
Yeah, and there's so many little things that seem to be very important about that woman and her father, because her father, they lived in a remote place, like a farm complex.
Well, weren't they originally from Hamburg, and they moved from West Germany to East Germany?
Yeah, everybody was going
when
east,
everybody else was trying to escape the other way.
They were going in the wrong direction. And so they lived in a remote place. This was like a farmhouse compound thing, so not close to other people. And her father had a study room, and that's confirmed, multiple sources that people have talked to. He had a study office room full of illegal literature. Now, anything illegal in the Soviet Union, he had a copy of it. And so then he was inviting these other selected students that his daughter knew. He was inviting these students to his office. He gave them this forbidden literature and talked to them about socialism. How it should be, how it is, blah, blah, blah. So maybe they did something, or pretended to do something, that ultimately impressed Western powers. And that's maybe
it's the communism with a human face, duh.
or maybe they pretended to be the underground. They pretended to be members of this conservative Christian underground. I mean, there was
maybe
she faked an invitation from Poland because he needed a valid reason to go to another Soviet country. He couldn't just drive there. She faked an invitation to Poland, and then she got there, and she met with people from the Solidarity resistance circles, and she returned home, and she was checked on the border in the train, and they found some leaflets from that Polish group. But because of her father, and because all her connections, this was not seen as a problem. But what was she really doing there? Why
operation. It was an operation.
To me personally, it sounds like a training op. It sounds, or maybe even advanced operation. She would do this for someone. And she was trying to... She was
being prepped to be a future leader.
Shield this from the normal authorities, and maybe kind of, something like that. There's such an amount of secrecy regarding her. But, I mean, my suspicion is that she did something and her father did something that impressed the West enough to work with her. And just to
see, this is the problem with, it's like you watch a baseball game. I mean, you don't have baseball in Germany, but in America we have baseball, and you have this thing that tells you all the people on the team. This guy's playing left field and right field, and there's two teams. But the problem with all this is that the people on the one team are maybe the guy that's actually pitching for one team is really secretly working for the other team, right? Yeah. He's going to pitch it over the plate so the other team can get a home run on purpose. And the guy's going to fumble it at second base because he's really working for the. So you can't tell what team anybody is in this game.
And it's literally playing with fire, because we talked about this in one of the episodes. If the Russians actually get what they want, the Russians get all of Germany, some other places, they get our industry, they get our experts, they can make all these precision parts that the Russians can't really make themselves. This would actually catapult Russia to a new dimension of imperialism, and then it becomes a huge problem for America. Because right now, you can trash talk the Russians, of course, for all their ridiculous shortcomings, and people say Russia is not really a superpower. If you take away the nuclear missiles, they're basically a big gas station. Okay, so but what happens when they get us? What happens if they take us, and then America has a different enemy to deal with? So all this stuff with Merkel and all these other people, that will become an American problem.
In Moscow, they've always seen Germany as the key to owning all of Europe.
Yeah.
They've always seen that. And Germany is, of course, at the heart of Europe, and it's got the biggest population of the main European countries. And it's had this massive technological and industrial capacity in the past compared to its neighbors, much more than France, much more than Italy, much more than Poland. So Germany is this key country, and they saw that as the key, infiltrating it. And so getting to Berlin at the end of the Second World War, establishing that enclave in East Germany. So just now we're at the end of our period and wrapping up the Cold War, and we couldn't cover everything. We're just going 3 hours is too long, people say, but there's so much to talk about, and we want to go push past the Cold War now into the 1990s and what happened. But maybe you could just comment a little bit about East Germany. Is it integrated? Is East Germany different? No. Has it changed? Has it become West Germany? No. Okay, please explain.
No, it's still two countries, and it's been like that since the reunification. People did projections before the actual reunification. They looked at what's it going to cost. How much money do we have to inject into the East to save all these companies or combines, or what they call them, because this was Soviet economy, and it was not able to compete with Western prices.
It wasn't plug and play. You couldn't just plug in a Soviet style economy into a Western one and have it work.
Exactly. So there was so many jobs over there. There were so many factories over there that could not compete on a Western market or world market.
Right. So right. Because the products they make are so shoddy and so inferior and so awful.
Well, they
nobody wants them.
They were not allowed to have what we had in the West. This individual entrepreneurship, make something better, surprise everybody. They couldn't do that. They were not allowed to do that. Now, of course, they had the Saxony Academy of Sciences. They were still drawing from these old networks of great minds, scientific minds, but the system kept everything down. So by the time you had a potential reunification, what will it cost to save the jobs over there? What products could they make? Because some of these products were military, and those were no longer deemed to be necessary.
So is East Germany become a kind of welfare attachment to West Germany since its industries can't compete? What is it now?
Well, it is like a separate country, and you can only be so long under communist rule until you change. You change. And when the reunification happened, and this was just one idea of many, they had an idea of maybe we keep two states, maybe we have one inside NATO and the other not, or maybe were different ideas, but the reunification really was mostly on paper. And some of these companies over there, or factories over there, they were liquefied, and stuff was taken over by larger conglomerates, and that created a lot of resentment in Eastern Germans. And so, nowadays, there's still a big communist movement over there, and there's a big right-wing right-wing extremist movement, and now they're combining the right and the left over there. So they've been calling people over there. They vote extreme parties, and they've been calling for breaking off from the Union again, just to have these separate territories over there. And then once they break away, some of these activists say, once they break away, they will immediately sign deals with the Russians for economic and otherwise relations, which means a Russian takeover, essentially. So you could see that in the next couple of years, and I kid you not, that a lightning strike, a coup d'etat. I mean, right now, at this very moment, there's like the biggest court case in Germany with these extreme activists that are accused of plotting a coup, and they had Russian ties. They had Russian ties. They're in
they're
court
allegedly
right now.
Right-wingers. They're allegedly right-wingers.
And they even got themselves a prince, Prince Royce from a very old family, and he has a Russian girlfriend or a Russian wife, and they visited.
Isn't that funny?
They visited a Russian embassy. They had Russian contacts. People have been saying members of the group, they have these satellite phones. They got satellite phones from the Russians. So this is a serious case, probably the most serious case since
And it's so easy to read this. I mean, it's so easy to see what's really going on with this, isn't it? I mean, isn't this obvious?
Imagine a lightning strike, coup d'etat. People in the east of Germany, they take control over centers of government. They declare a new government, and they immediately sign, with no legitimacy whatsoever, with no Western recognition whatsoever. They sign these new deals with the Russians in 5 minutes, and then it's Russian-controlled territory. This could happen in the next couple of years, because these, there was never a reunified German identity. So these people don't even know what makes a German. What is the German way of living? We have no American Constitution. We have no history like that we can fall back on and say, this is the common framework, and within the framework you can try different things. We don't have that. So many disappointed people, and they will vote for anything that seems like radical or national Bolshevism, where the left and the right actually meet. And
the far left and the far right. So it's a kind of convergence.
There's another thing. So this right-wing party, the AfD, far right-wing party, the AfD, they've been rising in the polls like crazy. And now they had a few scandals, Russian money accusations, Chinese money accusations. Somebody was arrested.
Isn't that funny?
A guy was arrested, assistant to the leading right-wing politician. The assistant is like half Chinese, and he's accused of Chinese espionage and all that. Now, recently, the biggest candidate of that party for the European elections, that guy's talking about the SS and he said something like, well, you can't accuse everybody who was a member of the SS and blah, blah, blah. So this is like who they are. And, I have a sneaking suspicion about that, because the hope is, of course, that these scandals happened and they suffered in the polls because of it. I hope these scandals happened because of people in Czech intelligence, finding out the stuff, British intelligence supplying information, American intelligence supplying information. But there might be a Russian component to it as well, because we know from leaked documents that the Russians want national Bolshevism here. They want the left, the extreme left and the extreme right to merge. But for this to happen, you need to get rid of some of these extreme right-wingers because they're just too crazy, right? So if they are eliminated from the party, that could make it possible to have that coalition and to start controlling parts of East Germany. So maybe the Russians
the controlled opposition in a big way.
Maybe the Russians have leaked some of this stuff. Maybe the Russians have helped leak some of this stuff in order to change the party, because the way it's been running so far is not good enough for the Russian purposes. Because if you look at the opinion research and the way most Germans think, most Germans, they don't want an extreme right-wing party, right? But more people might actually be, warm up to the idea of a left-right syndicate conglomerate of parties.
A red-brown alliance.
You just do a bit of nostalgia. That's what they call it. It's like nostalgia, but with the the east.
Ost, which means east in German.
Nostalgia. You mix a bit of that in, and then you mix some nationalism in. Like they say, we don't want the controls over the economy based on climate change stuff. We don't want migrants. I mean, there are barely any migrants in the East anyway, but we don't want any migrants. We want this and that. So they attach themselves to popular opinions and popular ideas, but it's just to get voters, obviously. And they could create a coalition. They start to take over one bit of East Germany, maybe another one, and then they could actually try to declare a secession and then attach themselves to Moscow.
Yeah. Well, with that, we've seen how Germany is exploited and how the end of the Cold War has these ambiguous edges to it, and so we've tried to cover in a short period. It's a long. I think we've gone more than 3 hours today. We tried to cover the Cold War and the complexities, and it's just so difficult. But we want people to have the big overview, the big picture of what happened, and that there's more than the story you heard on the news. There's more going on here, and it's a story of infiltration and subversion, of disinformation and manipulation of Western idea of what's happened. And the Soviet Union, under the Russian Federation, it's just a continuation of the same. And they're allied with China and the rest of the communist bloc, and they're still coming after the U.S. They're still trying to destroy and sink the West. And so this is the main point. The Cold War didn't really end. It isn't really over. It's not just Golitsyn that's saying this. I'm quoting all these other sources, including Robert Buchar and Andrei Kudrescu and a number of figures, the defector Stanislav Lunev, Jan Shana, and of course the experience of all these people in Germany who see that it's not what it was billed to be anyway, even now. So I want to leave everybody with that. I want to thank you. I'm Jeff Nyquist. This has been Friends and Enemies, and with me has been Alex Benesch from Germany. And I thought what a great thing to be able to talk to a German writer and follower of this, and to cover it and discuss it, and maybe some new understandings would emerge. So I want to thank you for joining us. Next week, we're going to go to the post-Soviet era. We're going to start talking about the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and what happened in the 90s, and Yeltsin and the reforms, and how we end up getting to where we are now. So I want to thank you for joining us, and until next time.